Good afternoon. The 9,027th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. I would like to take this opportunity to thank, on behalf of the Council, Ambassador Barbara Woodward, Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom, for her service as President of the Council for the month of April. I would like to express the Council's appreciation to Ambassador Woodward and her team for the skill with which they conducted the Council's business last month. Thank you, Barbara. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Germany, Greece, Italy, Latvia, Poland, Slovakia, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I welcome His Excellency, Mr. Piotr Glinski, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Culture and National Heritage of Poland. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Martin Griffiths, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Ms. Michelle Bachelet, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Ms. Tatiana Luzan, Advocacy Coordinator, Right to Protection. It is so decided. Mr. Griffiths, Ms. Bachelet, and Ms. Luzan are joining today's meeting via video teleconference. The Secretary General will now begin its the Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 on the agenda. And I wish to warmly welcome the Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, and give him the floor.
Madam President, Excellencies, I welcome this opportunity to address the Security Council on my recent visit to the Russian Federation and Ukraine, where I met with President Putin and President Zelensky on the 26th and the 28th of April, respectively. As part of my regional visit, I also had discussions with President Erdogan in Ankara and President Duda in Rzeszów, Poland. Throughout my travels, I did not mince words. I said the same thing in Moscow as I did in Kyiv, which is exactly what I have repeatedly expressed in New York, namely that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a violation of its territorial integrity and of the Charter of the United Nations, and that it must end for the sake of the people of Ukraine, Russia, and the entire world. Madam President, I visited Moscow and Kyiv with a clear understanding of the realities on the ground. I entered an active war zone in Ukraine with no immediate possibility of a national ceasefire and a full-scale ongoing attack on the east of the country. Before the visit, the Ukrainian government issued an appeal to the United Nations and to me personally, expressed publicly by the Deputy Prime Minister, regarding the dire plight of civilians in the devastated city of Mariupol and specifically the Azovstal plant. In my meeting with President Putin, I therefore stressed the imperative enabling humanitarian access and evacuations from besieged areas, including first and foremost Mariupol. I strongly urged the opening of a safe and effective humanitarian corridor to allow civilians to reach safety from the Azovstal plant. A short time later, I received confirmation of an agreement in principle. We immediately followed up with intense preparatory work with the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, along with Russian and Ukrainian authorities. Our objective was to initially enable the safe evacuation of those civilians from the Azovstal plant, and later the rest of the city, in any direction they choose, and to deliver humanitarian aid. I am pleased to report on some measure of success. Together, the United Nations and the ICRC are leading a humanitarian operation of great complexity, both politically and in terms of security. It began on 29 April and has required enormous coordination and advocacy with the Russian Federation and Ukrainian authorities. So far, 2 safe passage convoys have been successfully completed. In the first, concluded on 3 May, 101 civilians were evacuated from the Azovstal plant, along with 59 more from a neighboring area. In the second operation, completed last night, more than 320 civilians were evacuated from the city of Mariupol and surrounding areas. A third operation is underway, but it is our policy not to speak about the details of any of them before they are completed, to avoid undermining possible success. It is good to know that even in these times of hyper-communications, silent diplomacy is still possible and is sometimes the only effective way to produce results. So far in total, nearly 500 civilians found long-awaited relief after living under relentless shelling and scarce availability of water, food and sanitation. The evacuees have shared moving tales with UN staff. Mothers, children and frail grandparents spoke of their trauma. Some were in urgent need of medical attention. I hope that the continued coordination with Moscow and Kyiv will lead to more humanitarian pauses to allow civilians safe passage from the fighting and aid to reach those in critical needs. We must continue to do all we can to get people out of these hellscapes. And the Secretary-General and the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, will brief you today in greater detail on the latest efforts in Mariupol and additional steps. Our Commissioner Bachelet will brief on reports of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, possible war crimes, and the need for accountability. As I discussed yesterday with President Zelensky, the UN will continue to scale up humanitarian operations, save lives, and reduce suffering. Madam President, my meetings with both leaders also focused on the crucial issue of global food security. And indeed, the worldwide implications of this war were in full view in my subsequent travels to West Africa. In Senegal, Niger and Nigeria, I heard direct testimony from leaders and civil society on how the war is unleashing a food security crisis. We need quick and decisive action to ensure a steady flow of food and energy in open markets by lifting export restrictions, allocating surpluses and reserves to those who need them, and addressing food price increase to calm market volatility. But let me be clear, a meaningful solution to global food insecurity requires reintegrating Ukraine's agricultural production and the food and fertilizer production of Russia and Belarus into world markets despite the war. I will do my best to help facilitate a dialogue to help make this a reality. At the same time, the war in Ukraine in all its dimensions is setting in motion a crisis that is also devastating global energy markets, disrupting financial systems, and exacerbating extreme vulnerabilities for the developing world. That is precisely why I established the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy and Finance to mobilize UN agencies, multilateral development banks and other international institutions to help countries face these challenges. We were particularly engaged in making proposals at the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. Madam President, Excellencies, the war on Ukraine is senseless in scope, restless in its dimensions, and limitless in its potential for global harm. The cycle of death, destruction, dislocation, and disruption must stop. It is high time to unite and end this war, and I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Linda, Madam President, thank you very much indeed. As we've just heard from the Secretary General, elements of diplomatic progress are coming into view even as civilian suffering mounts. So I'll speak briefly today, if I may, about the human toll of this war, and then about what we're doing to address humanitarian needs, including a short update on our latest operations. And I know that High Commissioner Bachelet will, of course, detail the impact on civilians for you, so I will be brief. Just to recap, the destruction of civilian infrastructure has come to characterize this conflict. Apartment buildings, schools, and hospitals in populated areas have been attacked, and they must not be so. Over 13 million Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes, of whom 7.7 million are displaced inside Ukraine. Lives have been uprooted, ripped apart, and never will be the same again. And many others couldn't run. Often the most vulnerable are simply stuck. The elderly, people with disabilities have been unable to seek shelter from bombs, get out to gather supplies, or receive information on evacuations. And the threat of gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence, sexual exploitation and abuse, and human trafficking, as I'm sure we will hear from the other briefers, risen hugely since the war began. Allegations of sexual violence against women, girls, men, and boys are mounting. Roads, as we've all seen, are heavily contaminated with explosive ordnance, putting civilians at risk and stopping humanitarian convoys from reaching them. Madam President, let me briefly brief you on what the UN and our humanitarian partners are trying to do inside Ukraine to meet these growing needs. We have now 217 humanitarian partners with whom we are working in Ukraine. And I think we have now scaled up at record speed. We have more than 1,400 staff, UN staff, deployed across the country, operating out of 8 hubs beyond Kyiv, with staff, warehouses, and supplies in 30 locations, principally, of course, across the east, where the war is happening and the needs are greatest. We reach more than 4.1 million people with some form of assistance on a daily basis across all the country's 24 oblasts. Our humanitarian response has 3 main aspects. First, we deliver a great deal of humanitarian assistance and protection services to displaced people, and I know it's not enough, and I'm sure it's adequate, and I know we'll hear more on that. But that's all across the country, especially where internally displaced people have sought safety, or where people have begun returning, a crucial new element, to severely damaged communities. And when I was in Irpin just a few weeks ago, the mayor was describing to us, as he, I think, described to the Secretary General, how his people are trying to get back to Irpin, but to do so, the reconstruction will take, as he's put it, a year and a half. So restoring basic services necessary to survival is key, and I was very struck by the fact that the International Committee of the Red Cross very, very quickly after the conversation I'd had, but not as a result of that, went in to repair the basic services element for the population of Irpin to be able to return. In these areas, injecting cash aid allows civilians to choose what they need and offers a modicum of dignity in these fractious times. It helps to keep markets open and liquidity and supply chains moving. We plan to reach 1.3 million people with cash assistance, plugging into Ukraine's social protection system with top-up payments, working with the government, working with the Prime Minister and his plans for the distribution of cash to his people to reach family at risk. This is needed technical liaison, but it's now largely achieved. Cash-based aid will now scale up very, very quickly indeed. A second part, that's the first part. The second part of our response is working on pre-positioning supplies to forward operating bases and increasing our preparedness in areas to where we imagine this war might move next. And third, and we've heard from the Secretary General, we engage every single day with parties to the conflict to push for the movement of aid to civilians in areas of active conflict or to negotiate to help civilians leave for safer areas. We have been able, Madam President, so far to stage 5 interagency aid convoys to some of the hardest hit areas, operations which required a humanitarian notification system to both parties to allow for those safe passage movements. They've been a lifeline, a small mercy perhaps, to civilians encircled by fighting, bringing in medical supplies, water, food rations, non-food items, and so forth. But it's a beginning, but hopefully it's not an end. And as the Secretary General has described, as a result of his own efforts, we've seen a glimmer of hope in these past days, thanks to his efforts and those of our colleagues on the front line. As you know, on May the 2nd, more than 100 civilians were evacuated from the Azovstal plant in Mariupol, including women, children, and older people. About 60 more people joined that convoy on the outskirts of Mariupol and were then able to move to safety. And it was, as the Secretary General has described, a project of the greatest complexity and of constant oversight, and it was an exceptional operation. I'm especially grateful. I'd like to record here our thanks to the International Committee of the Red Cross and the leadership of Peter Maurer, as well as to our own highly experienced first responders. But I must also applaud the authorities and essentially the respective militaries of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation for their close and constructive and essential cooperation in making that operation a reality. It showed us that that can happen. And I believe, though the numbers weren't great, that a single life saved is worth every ounce of effort. And as of yesterday, as the Secretary General said, we were able to move more than 320 civilians out of the Mariupol area broadly, again working closely in lockstep with ICRC and with the cooperation of the Ukrainian and the Russian authorities. And today we have that third operation, which began this morning with the intent of evacuating civilians from Mariupol and Azovstal. And as he said, we prefer not to speak about that operation until it is complete. What I can finally say about this is we're seeing the fruits of our labor over these past many weeks of establishing a liaison in Moscow, of the visits that preceded the Secretary General and which were brought into fruition by his own long and detailed meetings with the leaderships of both sides in this last week. We are beginning to see now the agreement on local ceasefires, because none of these movements of safe passage will happen without local ceasefires, pauses, windows of silence. So we're making some progress, and we're building relations, and we're building experience, which we hope we can then broaden to more such operations. And that is the third element of our humanitarian program. We'll keep pushing for more civilians to be able to leave Mariupol and indeed Azovstal if they so choose. And we'll now begin on that basis to explore options for reaching others where the need is greatest and where we need and desire to serve the people of Ukraine in their hour of direst need. Madam President, thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Michelle Bachelet.
Madam President, Excellencies, for over 8 years, since 15 March 2014, my office, through the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, has been monitoring the situation in Ukraine. To date, we have released close to 50 periodic and thematic reports. On the 24th of February 2022, we quickly adapted to a very different working environment. Like millions of Ukrainians, the staff of my office relocated to other regions in the country, but, and I'm very proud to say, have not paused their work for a single day. Currently, the mission has staff on the ground in Uzhgorod, Kyiv, Lviv, Dnipro, Donetsk, and Odessa, and conducts field visits to various parts of the country, including Kyiv and Chernihiv region just last week. The mission continues to verify allegations of violations of international human rights law and of international humanitarian law in the context of the Russian Federation's armed attack on Ukraine. Many of these allegations concern violations that may amount to war crimes. Based on the mission work, my office updated the UN Human Rights Council at the end of March and will present a report on the human rights situation in Ukraine covering the period from 24 February to 15 May at the next session of the Council in June. And my press statement on Ukraine on the 22nd of April summarized our most recent findings. It pains me to say that all our concerns remain valid and the situation keeps deteriorating. Madam President, today is the 71st day of the escalation of the hostilities, expanding the already 8-year-long conflict to all regions of the country. Reports of deadly incidents, such as attacks on Hospital Number 3 and the Drama Theater in Mariupol, on the railway station in Kramatorsk, on residential areas in Odessa, have become shockingly frequent. There seems to be no end in sight to the daily reports of civilian death and injuries. My team on the ground conveys the palpable trauma and shock experienced by people they speak with, the vast majority of whom have either personally witnessed a violation or are victims themselves. Rather than try to describe what victims are going through, let me use their words. Residents of Mariupol set up a Telegram channel to share information about their relatives who perished in the city, and I will quote them. He was killed in front of his wife and children. Her body remained under the debris of her house. We could not even bury her. My uncle died from loss of blood after sustaining fragmentation injuries. I only know he was buried in a collective grave. I could share many more such messages. Last week, on the 28th of April, when the UN Secretary General was visiting Kyiv to meet the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, the city was hit by 2 missiles. At least one woman, a journalist, was killed, and 4 civilians were injured in the attack. An OSCHR team was in Kyiv on that day too, preparing to visit Busha. On the same day, we corroborated 22 civilian deaths and 40 civilian injuries in other places of Ukraine. Members of the Council, in Ukraine, my office has recorded 6,731 civilian casualties since the 24th of February. We know the real figures are considerably higher. As my office consistently reports, most of these casualties have been caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, such as shelling from heavy artillery, including multiple launch rocket systems, missiles, and airstrikes. My office is also documenting the devastating consequences of the conflict on other human rights. In areas around Kyiv from late February for about 5 weeks, Russian forces targeted male civilians who they consider suspicious. Men that were detained, beaten, summarily executed, and in some cases taken to Belarus and Russia, unbeknownst to their families and held in pretrial detention facilities. My staff met with families who are searching for their missing male relatives, desperate to know where they are, if they are alive, or how they can get them back. Families were shot as they tried to escape in convoys. In some areas, it was dangerous to cross the street with snipers or soldiers shooting at anyone who tried. Local authorities are compiling lists of deaths and missing, continuing exhumations, taking DNA from relatives, while also trying to reconnect districts to electricity and water. In other areas controlled by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups, such as Kharkiv, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, we continue to document arbitrary detention and possible enforced disappearances of representatives of local authorities, journalists, civil society activists, retired servicemen, and the armed forces, and other civilians by Russian armed forces and affiliated armed groups. As of 4th of May, my office has documented 180 such cases, of which 5 victims were eventually found dead. We have also documented 8 possible enforced disappearances of people considered to be pro-Russian in government-controlled territory. My staff heard about cases of women having been raped by Russian armed forces in areas that were under their control, as well as other allegations of sexual violence by both parties to the conflict. And yet, the stigma around rape and sexual violence continues to prevent victims and their families from feeling safe to report. This only highlights the importance of ensuring adequate and safe support services for victims. Grim evidence of torture, ill treatment, and summary executions of prisoners of war committed by both parties to the conflict is surfacing. My office is collecting such evidence, which will be included in its future reporting. The only way for these horrors to stop is for armed forces to fully respect their obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. It is vital that all parties give clear instruction to their combatants to protect civilians and persons hors de combat, as well as to distinguish between civilian and military objects. Those in command of armed forces must make it clear to their members that anyone found to have been involved in such violations will be prosecuted and held accountable. Accountability demands that evidence be preserved and that mortal remains be treated with decency. Madam President, members of the Council, the list of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law continues to grow each day, and we cannot let the number of victims continue to rise. A one-day ceasefire alone would spare the lives of at least 50 civilian children, women, and men, including many older persons. A one-day ceasefire would prevent 30 to 70 civilians from being injured and a dozen from becoming disabled. A one-day ceasefire would allow several thousand civilians to safely leave areas where they are currently trapped in hostilities. Most importantly, a ceasefire will show that the horror in Ukraine can be stopped. It is of the most fundamental importance that the ongoing hostilities cease once and for all. Madam President, advocating for accountability is a cornerstone of my office work. If the perpetrators of violations against civilians and persons or the combat are brought to justice, potential perpetrators will think twice before unleashing similar unlawful attacks or acts of violence and creating new victims. Accountability also contributes to the healing process for the victims, the family, and the society at large. National justice systems are the most crucial. I urge the parties to the conflict to investigate all violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law allegedly committed by their armed forces, and I welcome Ukraine's efforts in this regard. My office is fully committed to supporting those systems and the work of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, and to cooperating with the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and other international justice mechanisms in accordance with our established UN frameworks. Let us commit to putting a stop to this senseless conflict. We must be steadfast in our efforts for peace and resolute that justice will be done. I thank you for your attention.
I thank Ms. Bachelet for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Tatiana Lizan.
Thank you, Madam President. It is a great honor to represent today's civil society that mobilized the first hours after the full-scale Russian invasion of February 24, as they did before, for 8 years of the war. Our joint efforts are aimed at supporting brave Ukrainians, fighting at the forefront, as well as in public offices in Lviv, Kyiv, and Kramatorsk. These are volunteers, municipal workers planting flowers in Kharkiv and other cities in Ukraine under heavy shelling, railway workers evacuating people away from hostilities and death, bakers, cashiers at groceries, and all people affected by the war. All Ukrainians are now beating as one big heart. In the chaos of war, no one should be left behind. People, their lives and health, honor, dignity, and security shall always remain the highest value. In order to maintain this goal, Ukraine and the whole civilized world shall face immense challenges caused by the military invasion of the Russian Federation. The war has been lasting for 8 years. In 2021, the number of IDPs in Ukraine fleeing occupied territories of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions officially was almost 1.5 million. At the end of April, the International Organization for Migration informed that the number of internally displaced persons as a result of the full-scale invasion of the territory of Ukraine reached 7.7 million. They all carried the same heavy burden of displacement. They all need equal protection. Also, should not be forgotten those Ukrainians who were forcibly displaced to the Russian Federation. from Mariupol, Chernihiv, Severodonetsk, and other cities and villages. These people were forcibly displaced without documents and means of communication, exposed to the filtration by the Russian Federation. Within these 2 last months, over 1 million people overall, and around 200,000 children among them, were forcibly displaced to the Russian Federation from Ukraine. It must be ensured that those who are willing to come back to Ukraine or travel to other countries have the possibility to do so. Challenges that children and their parents experience in the face of war are overwhelming. Right to Protection received calls via our hotline where parents were ready to send their children abroad with complete strangers, out of desperation because of the Russian atrocities happening in Kharkiv, Mariupol, and other cities. The world was shaken with stories of little boys, aged even 4 or 5, crossing the state border alone, or in the best case scenario with very familiar people. Ukraine, as well as accepting countries, shall resume responsibility over these vulnerable little Ukrainians, so that the children are safely crossing the state borders, supported by specifically trained state guard officers and child service representatives. The accepting countries shall guarantee a high level of their protection. Family reunification should be presumed, and their safe and timely return to Ukraine after the end of the war must be ensured. The number of killed and injured civilians is permanently increasing. The destinies of dozens of thousands of people in Mariupol, Kherson, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Irpin are unknown. Relatives cannot always prove the death of their beloved, even if they witnessed their last moments themselves. International community shall assist the government of Ukraine in establishing and enforcing appropriate measures of investigation and prosecution, since each life is priceless, and relatives deserve to know the truth. I want to mention those Ukrainians who have fled Ukraine seeking safety and security in the European Union and other countries in the civilized world. These Ukrainians, overwhelming majority women and children, should not be overlooked in terms of observance of their rights, shelter, human trafficking, access to service, including psychological help. Stateless persons and third country nationals who had previously found refuge in Ukraine shall be granted protection along with the Ukrainians. Finally, of paramount importance is to recall the immense number of IDPs, many of whom may not have a roof over their heads. In many cases, the conditions of temporary accommodation do not comply with basic rules of adequate shelter. IDPs live in collective or transit centers established in schools, places of common use, often not designed for stay during cold times. Over 32 million square meters of housing property were destroyed, damaged, or occupied. Despite the massive destruction, as the whole world has seen in Bucha, Irpin, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, thousands of civilians either returned back or never left their damaged homes. All of them urgently need adequate temporary or permanent accommodation, especially for the cold autumn and winter periods. Those who chose not to leave their damaged homes shall receive the much needed tangible support, such as the construction materials and tools, plastic wrap, and physical help. Additionally, such unprecedented massive destruction of civilian infrastructure requires durable solutions from the Ukrainian authorities with support of the international community. We call on all members of the Security Council, international organizations, and governments to support Ukrainians firmly in these dark times. In the name of millions of people who have died, unborn, survived, residents of Ukraine, a UN member since 1945, we require to rephrase and breathe new sense in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights for living in peace. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Ms. Lausanne for her briefing. I would like to draw the attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of Note 507, which encourages all participants in council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President, and may I start by congratulating the UK presidency for their excellent stewardship of the Council during the month of April, and wish you, Madam President and dear Linda, as well as the US team, the very best for this month. I'd like also to thank the Secretary General for his remarks, for his clear positioning in upholding the international law, and even more so for his efforts to negotiate a safe passage for civilians in Mariupol during his recent visit to Russia and Ukraine. We all must be proud of what the UN system is doing to help Ukraine and its people. I'd like also to thank USG Griffiths, High Commissioner Bachelet, and Ms. Lausanne for their important and updated information, yet a sobering one. Madam President, the absurd, unprovoked, unjustified, and still going on war of choice of Russia and Ukraine is in its 3rd month. While Russia continues to be immured in total denial, the world continues to witness a never-ending human tragedy. Despite worldwide calls, there is no end in sight. Calls for a humanitarian pause during Orthodox Easter were unheeded. The war continues to inflict undue pain on Ukraine and its people. Indiscriminate shelling and bombing of population areas, the killing of civilians and attacks on health facilities, schools, and civilian infrastructure continue. Extrajudicial killings, sexual violence, and rape, actions that may amount to war crimes, have been documented and are mounting, as we heard by USG Griffiths. Eastern and southern parts of Ukraine are now facing severe consequences, while airstrikes continue in multiple areas in Ukraine, causing additional damage and civilian losses. Every time we meet here, there are new reports of casualties, news of more atrocities uncovered, and more destruction inflicted. Just like that apartment hit in Odessa, killing 8 civilians, including a 3-month-old baby, or those dreadful accounts just mentioned by the High Commissioner Bachelet. But Russia's actions are not limited in Ukraine only. More than 5 million people have been forced to cross the borders. No one could have imagined how quickly the world's bread basket could go from wheat fields to battlefields. Global hunger is soaring to alarming levels, exacerbated like never before by this war that is destroying a country, that is aggressing developing countries, and is challenging the entire world. Dear colleagues, 1,200 bodies have been discovered so far around Kiev, and almost all civilians killed by a bullet in the head. You remember, Kremlin considered Ukrainians as brothers, and yet it is killing them. When you kill your family, you are a monster. Soldiers have tortured, raped, and murdered only to be honored for their bravery. They should be called to account, not celebrated. As Russia stalls and keeps redrawing its strategy, all indicates that disabused commanders have abandoned military doctrine, and to prove any form of success are flattening cities and terrorizing civilians. This is the victory à la Russe. When you cannot prevail on the battlefield, you resort to atrocities, a terrible match of incompetence with brutality. This is a cruel reality and a dreadful prospect. Madam President, the more Russia struggles in front of Ukraine's resistance, the more Kremlin's rhetoric continues to escalate into the madman's idea of nuclear war. Nuclear saber-rattling is ignominious. Once it was the president himself, then another official, and then the unstoppable propaganda machine. What is the purpose of showing in the TV a nuclear weapon that could trigger a tsunami strong enough to flood the entire UK? What is the logic of staging a nuclear explosion in the heart of Ireland? There could not be a more striking contrast between dreams and projects of science for conquering space and extending human civilization beyond the planet, and this archaic and rotted rhetoric of the possible use of weapons of mass destruction, of annihilation of civilization because of the war of choice that is being lost. Leon Trotsky has written, and I quote, "The army is a copy of society and suffers from all its diseases, usually at a higher temperature." This is why truth is critical, so that the domestic and international opinion does not fall for the propaganda and the conspiracy theories vehiculated relentlessly from a black hole from where only darkness is escaping. Only yesterday we celebrated World Press Freedom Day, and I'd like to pay tribute to all the brave journalists that are risking their lives to tell the truth, to keep the world informed about the war in Ukraine. Russian citizens must learn that this war is not glorifying their country. It has isolated it like never before. It is not making it more prosperous. To the contrary, it is vertiginously spiraling it down. It is not transporting it to modernity, but rather dragging it into a revolved past. No one wants to destroy Russia. No one wants to cancel Russia. If Kremlin has made bad choices and taken wrong decisions, they can correct the course, which means stop the war, recall troops back home, choose reason, return to diplomacy, respect their neighbor, and let that big Ukraine heart beat in freedom, as Ms. Luzin mentioned. This is what is needed. The key word here is mere. Madam President, after several failed attempts, safe passage was arduously secured for a number of civilians in Mariupol steel facility, which, as we heard, are underway. This is a testimony, a welcome, but a meager one comparing the scale of tragedy in Ukraine, that diplomacy, vocal or silent, can work, but there must be a will. Those lucky ones that would see the sun again after weeks in the underground to escape relentless shelling tell that before being escorted to non-occupied parts of Ukraine, they had been interrogated by FSB agents seeking information on the tunnels of Azovstal steel complex with a view to locating Ukrainian soldiers still in that only part of Mariupol not occupied by the Russian forces. And occupied means destroyed. Only 2 months ago, Mariupol was a thriving city with almost 500,000 inhabitants. The scorched earth strategy applied by Russia has made it the catacomb of Ukraine. Madam President, we know now the main mantra of the pretext of the war was invasion of Ukraine is to denazify the country, despite the fact that the first citizen, the president of Ukraine, is Jewish. Yet the theory has been further elaborated. Pretending that the most ardent anti-Semites are usually Jews, that Hitler had Jewish blood, which underlines the theory that Jews inflicted the Holocaust to themselves, just like the Ukrainians are supposedly slaughtering their people and destroying their own country. This is not black humor. This is not one of those basic fake news you easily discard as rubbish. This is part of the worst conspiracy theory warfare. And when you have the top diplomat dwell on such disgracefulness, this is a terrible low coming from a very dangerous high. Madam President, we are not in the business of competition who speaks more or louder. We are here to try to stop this war, to stop those crimes, protect civilians, and to make sure that the perpetrators do not have a place in our world, but only in theirs, the one where they pay for their deeds through accountability. We welcome the huge efforts of the European Union to respond to the massive increase in humanitarian needs in providing military, financial, and support and other support for the reconstruction. We welcome the high-level International Donors Conference for Ukraine held today in Warsaw, and Albania took part and made a commitment there. Madam President, the Secretary General, as we heard, was received in Moscow for uneasy talks with authorities. He also visited Kiev. As appalling and as shameful it may be, Kiev was shelled during his visit and while he was speaking. Rarely have we witnessed such a degree of disregard for the UN and its Secretary General such contempt for the organization and the entire UN personnel. I don't know how the Russians explain this, unless in the very same way as for everything else, the Ukrainians did it. Let me end with this note. We should strongly reject any idea of territorial division of Ukraine imposed by force as a result of aggression. We have mentioned it before and we reiterate it now. The creation of artificial entities, either by occupation or by proxies, is unacceptable. That should not be accepted in Ukraine or anywhere else. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I congratulate the United Kingdom for its presidency last month, and I wish the United States every success during its presidency this month. I thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres, the High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet, Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths and Ms. Tatiana Luzan for their briefings today. I begin by recognizing the efforts of the Secretary General during his recent mission to Russia and Ukraine, which, inter alia, enabled the evacuation of a considerable number of civilians that found themselves in extremely critical conditions in the Azovstal plant in Mariupol. In this context, the work of the International Committee of the Red Cross is also commendable. Humanitarian assistance must continue to be our priority through the implementation of Resolution ES11/2, adopted on the 24th of March this year by the General Assembly. We support the Secretary General in his good offices and in his diplomatic work to achieve a peaceful solution to this conflict, which has already lasted more than 10 weeks and which has had very grave consequences for the Ukrainian civilian population and whose repercussions at a global level are beginning to already have a harsh impact. While a cessation of hostilities is not reached and progress is made towards a diplomatic solution, the objective must be to urgently provide the required humanitarian aid and protect the civilian population and the infrastructure that is needed to meet basic needs. Madam President, the numbers that have been shared with us with regard to the numbers of victims and the harm and the cost caused by this conflict to date are alarming. And the most regrettable is that it is likely that the real figures will be even greater. 1 year ago, this Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2573. This resolution calls on all parties to armed conflicts to fully abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law. It is inadmissible, as reported by the World Health Organization, that so far in the conflict, 186 attacks against health facilities and hospitals have already been recorded. In addition, we further deplore the attacks against schools, dams, railway stations, food storage facilities and housing, inter alia. These highlight the total disregard for international humanitarian law. Once again, we reiterate the obligation to distinguish between civilian populations and civilian property on the one hand, and combatants and military targets on the other. It is not acceptable to attack, destroy, or cripple crucial assets for the survival of the civilian population. This is all the more tragic when it happens in the context of great and growing humanitarian needs. Mexico will follow closely the developments on the investigation announced by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court on the situation in Ukraine. Such investigations are fundamental, not least because international law is the foundation of this organization, as it is also of multilateralism and any form of respectful coexistence between sovereign states. All parties are obliged to respect the obligations arising from the Charter of the United Nations and from the various treaties and other sources of international law, and, in particular, international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Madam President, Mexico's position has been unequivocal. We call for preventive diplomacy. We favour dialogue and a political solution based on international law, and above all, to put people at the heart of this Council's action, without exceptions, without conditions. We will continue calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities, because this is the highest of all priorities. We follow closely the ordinances of the International Court of Justice and the investigations of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. We reiterate that all states, in ratifying the United Nations Charter, committed to respecting the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of states. Ukraine cannot be an exception to this. My delegation will continue encouraging everything that enables unhindered access for humanitarian assistance, and we insist on the overwhelming need for the Security Council to overcome the paralysis that has held it hostage, and for it to be able to shoulder its responsibilities to stop the war and to restore peace in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Mexico for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, I wish to thank the Secretary General, as well as Madam Bachelet, Mr. Griffiths, and Madam Luzan for their briefings. I wish to applaud the remarkable work of United Nations agencies as well as humanitarian actors. We have just heard that your visit, Mr. Secretary General, to Kiev and Moscow facilitated the evacuation, resulted in the evacuation of hundreds of civilians. We are grateful for that. However, how many more are still there in the tunnels of the Azovstal steel plant, blocked in the corners of Mariupol, battered by the Russian army? There's a vital need for the evacuation of civilians to continue in a safe and secure way on a voluntary basis, leaving evacuees with a choice of destination. We condemn the resumption of the offensive by the Russian Federation and the maintenance of the siege of the city in contempt for the humanitarian law. We also condemn indiscriminate strikes, which struck Kiev during your visit, Mr. Secretary General. This reflects the low esteem with which the Russian Federation holds the United Nations, the Russian Federation which continues to trample upon the Charter and its core principles since the very beginning of this war. For more than 2 months, the Russian army has been killing civilians, including children, humanitarian personnel, and journalists. More than 1/4 of the Ukrainian population was forced to flee, and this figure continues to rise. Civilians have no respite, neither in schools nor in hospitals. Russia has been indiscriminately bombing the area, targeting water infrastructure and laying down mines in fields with the aim of stripping the Ukrainian population of the means necessary for their survival. There's a priority, an immediate cessation of hostilities and full respect for international humanitarian law. There is an urgent need for humanitarian access to be provided to Mariupol and all besieged cities at a time when more than 15 million people need assistance. France will continue to fully contribute to this. We delivered more than 815 tons of assistance in response to the crisis and more than 22,000 tons of urgent emergency assistance were delivered by the European Union. Our overall support will continue to increase and will reach $2 billion, as was organized by our president during the donors conference organized by our Polish and Swedish colleagues. Beyond Ukraine, the entire world has been afflicted by this war, which is liable to plunge 1/5 of the world's population into poverty, destitution, and food insecurity. Russia must lift the blockade of the Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea in order to facilitate food exports. Madam President, I state this emphatically. War criminals will be held accountable. In this regard, France supports the prompt deployment of accountability mechanisms. We will continue to be resolutely engaged alongside the Ukrainian people and international jurisdictions and mechanisms, including particularly the International Criminal Court. Lastly, I wish to reiterate the fact that France will continue to stand firmly by the side of Ukraine and its people, and I wish to pay tribute to them for their courage and their staunch resistance. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I wish to first of all thank Secretary General Guterres and Secretary General Griffith, High Commissioner Bachelet, and Ms. Luzan for their briefings. I've also listened to the statement by Ms. Luzan. The fighting in Ukraine has been raging on for more than 2 months, and China has repeatedly expounded its position thereon. The longer the conflict lasts, the more people will suffer. The priority at hand is to step up efforts to promote ceasefire and cessation of hostilities. Secretary General Guterres visited Russia and Ukraine last week and met with the leaders of the two countries, calling for creating conditions for effective dialogue so as to achieve a ceasefire as soon as possible. The Secretary General has also made unremitting efforts to mitigate the humanitarian situation. It is heartening to note that after the visit of the Secretary General, and thanks to the intensified coordination between the UN and the RCRC, Russia and Ukraine have agreed to arrange for the evacuation of the civilians stranded in Mariupol, and more than 300 civilians have been successfully evacuated from Mariupol and other places to Zaporizhia. China welcomes this positive progress that was made possible through consultations amongst the relevant parties, and thanks to the Secretary General for his instrumental role. At present, the humanitarian crisis caused by the conflict remains dire, and the ever-increasing civilian casualties are deeply lamentable. Once again, we call on the parties to the conflict to exercise maximum restraint, avoid hurting innocent civilians and civilian facilities, and give priority to ensuring the humanitarian relief and assistance for such vulnerable groups as women and children. Building on the evacuation work in Mariupol, all parties concerned should establish a broader and more efficient humanitarian coordination mechanism so as to ensure the safe and smooth operation of the evacuation and humanitarian rescue channels and minimize the humanitarian impact resulting from the conflict. International humanitarian agencies should continue to mobilize the international community to increase resource inputs, help Ukraine and its neighboring countries to cope with the pressure of humanitarian relief, spare no effort to save lives, alleviate people's sufferings, and create conditions for the safe and orderly return of refugees to their homes. Madam President, the signs that point to a protracted and enlarged conflict are truly worrying. It has to be pointed that delivering weapons will not deliver peace, and the conflict has no winners. Dialogue and negotiation is the only and inevitable way to resolve disputes. Russia and Ukraine have built some groundwork in the previous negotiations, all the more reason for them to continue talks against all odds. the international community should create enabling conditions for the Russia-Ukraine negotiations and do more things to facilitate the political settlement rather than the other way round. It is not only morally despicable to try and benefit from the turmoil, but also dangerous in reality. Doing so is doomed to backfire. Continued fighting and all-dimensional and indiscriminate sanctions are subjecting people in all countries, not least developing countries, to higher food prices, oil prices, and other hefty prices. Arbitrary seizure and freezing of foreign exchange reserves of other countries is tantamount to weaponizing economic interdependence, which is bringing more uncertainties and perils to the world economy and international relations. We call on the international community to strengthen macroeconomic policy coordination and work together to effectively regulate and contain the negative spillover effects of the Ukrainian conflict. Madam President, the lessons emanating from the Ukrainian crisis are profound and deserving of serious reflections. Security of all countries is indivisible. To base one country's security on the insecurity of other countries is neither reasonable nor operable. NATO's repeated eastward expansion after the Cold War has not only failed to make Europe any safer, but also sowed the seeds of conflict. Contrary to its claim to be an organization defensive in nature, NATO wantonly launches wars against sovereign countries, causing colossal casualties and humanitarian disasters. The day after tomorrow is May the 7th. On May the 7th, 1999, NATO fired a number of precision-guided missiles at the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia, killing 3 Chinese journalists and injuring more than 20 Chinese diplomats. The Chinese people will never forget this barbaric atrocity and will never allow such history to repeat itself. Now that the Cold War is behind us, NATO should naturally size up the situation and make necessary adjustments. Clinging to the anachronistic doctrine of security and keen to provoke bloc confrontation and create tensions in Europe and even in the Asia-Pacific region and world at large, such practices are as harmful to others as they are deleterious to the perpetrators themselves and deserve nothing less than China's firm opposition. The world does not need a new Cold War, and it cannot afford greater turmoil and division. China solemnly advocates that in order to solve the practical problems of human security and seek long-term solution to world peace, all countries should reaffirm their commitment to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, earnestly uphold the principle of indivisibility of security, forge synergy through consultations, and build together a balanced, effective, and sustainable global and regional security architecture. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Let me begin by congratulating you on your assumption of the presidency of the Council for the month of May and to wish you the best of success during the month. I also take this opportunity to thank Ambassador Barbara Woodward and the UK delegation for their able leadership of the Council last month. We thank the Secretary General for his statement and have paid close attention to the important briefings by the USG, Martin Griffiths, and Madam Mitchell Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and thank them also for their coordination of the United Nations efforts and actions in Ukraine. We also thank Ms. Tatiana Luzan for highlighting the work of her organization in the area of protection assistance. Madam President, it is the ordinary people of Ukraine who continue to bear the brunt of the war, with women, children, and the aged being disproportionately affected. Urgent action is therefore imperative to stem the rising humanitarian crisis and restore the hope of peace, which has so far eluded the people of Ukraine. We therefore welcome the important undertakings of the Secretary General during his recent visit to Moscow and Kyiv, where he held discussions with President Putin and President Zelensky, personally assessed the impact of the war, and helped to mobilize humanitarian evacuations in Mariupol. We encourage the continued deployment of the good offices of the Secretary General in the international endeavor to bring an end to the war and facilitate a diplomatic solution to the ongoing security and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. We commend the facilitative role played by the United Nations and the International Red Cross in the coordinated evacuation of civilians from the Azovstal steel plant on 3rd May 2022. We, however, regret the resumption of heavy shelling and airstrikes aimed at the steel plant before all the people could be removed to safety. Intense efforts must be made to secure the immediate evacuation of close to 1,000 people, including an estimated number of 30 children still holed up in the underground tunnels of the steel plant with little access to food, water, and medical assistance. We urge the parties to agree to further humanitarian pauses and demilitarize humanitarian corridors in all besieged areas to help protect the lives of civilians and ensure unobstructed delivery of humanitarian aid to alleviate suffering. We note the set obligation of the parties to conduct themselves in accordance with the rules of international law and international humanitarian law, and reiterate our call on them to implement necessary measures to protect civilians and humanitarian workers from harm, while also avoiding the deliberate destruction of civilian and critical infrastructure, including in Lviv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and the Donbas region, where intense fighting continues to rage. We continue also to be concerned by the growing reports of gross human rights violations and possible war crimes involving summary killings, forced disappearances, human trafficking, and conflict-related sexual violence, and reiterate the necessity of an independent, impartial, and thorough investigations to ensure effective accountability and secure justice for the innocent victims of the war. We welcome in this regard the investigations opened into all cases of alleged atrocities. Madam President, beyond the destruction and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, the impact of the war is already being felt on the food, energy, and financial systems of the world. The disruptions in food supply chains and the high cost of energy have caused historical rises in cost of living globally. The stifling economic effects, along with the existing difficulties of the COVID-19 pandemic, have the potential to fester sociopolitical tensions and instability, especially in developing economies that have little fiscal space to contain the shocks. Ending the war in Ukraine now is therefore not only urgent to avoid a direct humanitarian crisis for the Ukrainian people, but also critical to abate a global meltdown which would linger and have deep adverse impacts on the global economy, the security architecture, and the multilateral order. Furthermore, we are concerned that avowed commitments of their parties to engage in negotiations has so far not yielded the desired results due to growing mistrust and widening differences in expectations. We encourage the parties to recommit to the objectives of peace and the settlement of their disputes. The international community and the Security Council in particular must, in this context, overcome inherent challenges to facilitate a constructive dialogue. First, to support the immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities, and second, to provide a forum within which the core geopolitical and security concerns of the Russian Federation, Ukraine, and NATO and its allied countries can be sustainably addressed. In closing, Madam President, we call on the members of this Council to find common purpose in working to restore and maintain the peace and security of Ukraine. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Madam President. Congratulations on your assumption of the presidency this month. I thank the Secretary General for his remarks and welcome him back to New York after his extensive and important travels. I also thank the other briefers for their presentations and the work that they're doing every day, and welcome the participation of Ukraine's distinguished permanent representative, as well as the Deputy Prime Minister of Poland, among other speakers today. Madam President, the briefings we have heard make it clear that the war in Ukraine, caused by the armed breach of the country's territorial integrity by the Russian Federation, is causing extreme suffering. It is also sadly clear that sufficient care is not being accorded by combatants to the protection of civilians. After all, the millions of civilians who have fled their homes only did so because they understood that their lives and properties would be directly harmed in the course of the conflict. We are gravely concerned by the latest developments in Mariupol, Izium, and Popasna, among other cities. The reports from these cities reveal heavy artillery shelling and airstrikes that are destroying civilian objects at scale. These acts constitute a violation of the UN Charter, international law, and international humanitarian law. Kenya condemns the disproportionate use of force, the use of human shields, and the exploitation of civilian suffering as a tactic of war. As important as it is for the Security Council to be clear in its condemnation of those violating our shared values and rules, it is more urgent to stop the present cycle of escalation. Public statements by the combatants and their allies suggest that there is little respite from violence that civilians in Ukraine can look forward to. Instead, weapons and soldiers are being deployed in ever greater numbers. The war itself and its aims are being communicated as existential. There are even repeated mentions of the possible use of nuclear weapons being made in the media. The increased battlefield engagements, combined with their propaganda counterpart in the shaping of domestic and international public opinion, plus the apocalyptic tone, may lead to a far more dangerous escalation than is presently the case, with the result being even more Ukrainians being harmed. Connected to the harm being done to the civilians in Ukraine is the harm that the war is causing in other parts of the world. The inability of Ukraine to export its harvests and fertilizers is directly contributing to the immiseration of many millions, and serious harm is being caused to their food security. This is particularly the case in relatively poor and food insecure countries in the global south, including those in Africa. The unprecedented sanctions in response to the war are also reshaping global development, food security, and even political stability. With every new mention of nuclear weapons as part of the conflict continuum, or promises of unceasing war until one side is permanently disabled, global equity and debt markets will exit riskier emerging market economies, and investors will delay or cancel the investments that we all need to deliver sufficient jobs to our young people. Madam President, it is therefore our contention that the civilians in Ukraine, while under the more immediate threat of extreme violence, are united in their interest for safety with the billions of other civilians globally. It means that the whole world has a stake in an immediate cessation of hostilities for humanitarian purposes, followed by a structured ceasefire that enables meaningful negotiations between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. In addition, if we want the global markets to play a part in the development of the global south, rather than the reverse, then Europe's security order must be placed on a stable footing. Added to the growing global economic crisis, that stable security order in Europe is also needed if we are to limit the harm to civilians from climate change. The present arraying of major geopolitical forces in a growing conflict will make it next to impossible to undertake ambitious climate change action. Even before this war started, agreement on climate adaptation and mitigation action was plagued by lack of trust, changing goalposts, and unmet commitments. If climate change is indeed, as the science informs us, leading to serious harms to humanity, then we can count this war and its deleterious impact on multilateralism as yet another worldwide blow to the safety and security of civilians worldwide. Madam President, the multilateral system at this rate may not survive the multiple major crises we are causing while undermining its ability to solve them. As a minimum response to protecting the peace, Kenya urges member states to place more trust in the good offices of the Secretary General. The historical record of the use of these good offices is replete with shortcomings, but also with great successes. The decisive factor has been the extent to which conflicting states and their most influential allies give the Secretary General space to help mediate conflict at all stages. We therefore welcome the Secretary General's recent trips to Russia and Ukraine, where he sought commitments for a ceasefire, safe humanitarian passage, and to encourage negotiations. We urge the parties to embrace his readiness to mediate. Their doing so will signal their regard and respect for our United Nations. Madam President, I underscore in conclusion that the continued undermining and even destruction of multilateralism will only lead to more war. It will be a catastrophe for civilians in multiple regions and countries. Stopping the war in Ukraine offers us all an opportunity to live up to the Charter's promise to protect succeeding generations from our own shortcomings. I reaffirm Kenya's respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Kenya for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I would like to thank the participation of Secretary General Antonio Guterres, High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet, USG Martin Griffiths, and Ms. Tatiana Luzan, as well as their first-hand accounts from the conflict in Ukraine. The Brazilian government continues to follow closely the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Our utmost priorities should be the immediate cessation of hostilities and the strengthening of diplomatic negotiations in order to bring a lasting solution to this crisis, one that does not only end the conflict, but also contributes to improve the security and defense architecture in Europe. Further than the human rights violations and the humanitarian costs of the conflict, we are also attentive to the negative economic effects of the war for the whole world, especially in the form of higher food and energy prices, which have particularly dire consequences for developing countries. We acknowledge the efforts of the Secretary General in his recent visits to Moscow and Kyiv to discuss with Presidents Putin and Zelensky how to establish safe humanitarian corridors to allow the evacuation of civilians from conflagrated areas, such as in the city of Mariupol. We commend all the tireless work being done by the United Nations and the International Committee of the Red Cross to provide humanitarian aid to millions of people inside Ukraine, being cognizant that the needs of humanitarian assistance remain huge. We would also like to express our appreciation to the neighboring countries of Ukraine for keeping their borders open to refugees. I would also like to express my recognition to the Secretary General for having raised this afternoon, despite not being the central focus of this meeting, the impact that the conflict and its associated factors are having on food security worldwide. Brazil stresses the importance of all parties in the conflict to fully respect international humanitarian law, especially in its provisions regarding the protection of civilians. Of particular concern to Brazil are, first, the consequences of shelling of urban areas, including with the use of explosive weapons and the targeting of civilians. Second, the need to avoid the destruction of civilian infrastructure and the disruption of basic services. Third, the protection of the elderly, people with disabilities, and children, among other vulnerable groups. Fourth, the protection of humanitarian personnel and unimpeded humanitarian access. And fifth, the protection of refugees and internally displaced persons. It is our belief that the humanitarian resolution adopted by the General Assembly last March provides an adequate framework for concrete actions on the ground, as guaranteeing safe passage for civilians and unimpeded access for humanitarian personnel. Furthermore, Resolution A/Res/ES11/2 provides us with the main objectives we should strive to achieve, in particular, the full compliance by all parties to the armed conflict, to respect international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international refugee law. Within its capabilities, Brazil is contributing to the humanitarian efforts, offering shelter to citizens fleeing the armed conflict in Ukraine. Since last March, Brazil has granted temporary visas and residency authorization for Ukrainian nationals and stateless persons who have been affected or displaced by the events in Ukraine. Brazil has also donated food, medicine, and water purifiers to the victims of the conflict. Madam President, the lives and well-being of civilians in conflagrated areas are in great jeopardy. The cessation of hostilities is a matter of urgency. We have already witnessed too much suffering. The effective delivery of humanitarian aid is of paramount importance. Moreover, we need a resumption of diplomatic negotiations that are conducive to a peaceful and lasting solution to this crisis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and I'd like to welcome back the Secretary-General and thank him for his briefing this afternoon, and also to extend a particularly warm welcome to Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner Bachelet, and also thanks to Under-Secretary-General Griffiths, and a big thank you to Tatiana Luzan for updating us today, both of you, on the humanitarian disaster in Ukraine. Excuse me. Your briefings highlight yet again the utter senselessness of this unlawful war. Madam President, 11 weeks into this unjustified, unjustifiable war, we continue to witness widespread destruction, indiscriminate attacks, and unconscionable human suffering. As each day passes, reports of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law by Russia grow. And, as we've heard from colleagues around this table, the consequences are being felt far beyond Ukraine and Europe. Russia must end its war now. We salute the courageous decision by the Secretary-General to visit Moscow and Kyiv last week. The founders of these United Nations were clear on their primary objective: to prevent the human suffering wrought from war. The Secretary-General speaks for all of us in deploring this war and calling for its end. The cynical timing of further attacks on civilian infrastructure during your time in Kyiv, Secretary-General, and following your visit to Moscow, is further evidence of the disdain that has been shown towards the UN. It is more than regrettable that we should have to recall that the Secretary-General of the UN is appointed by all members of the UN. He is mandated by all members of the UN. We have a responsibility towards our Secretary-General. Secretary-General, what you witnessed in Bucha, in Irpin, in Borodyanka, follows the devastation wrought on Kharkiv, Kherson, and Mariupol, as well as elsewhere. Civilians, as you said, are paying the highest price for this conflict. We commend the work of the UN agencies in Ukraine and the organisations with whom they are working to alleviate the suffering there. They have our support, they have our appreciation. We welcome your work to put in place arrangements for the evacuation of civilians from Mariupol. We welcome the ongoing life-saving work of the UN and the ICRC there. We believe that thousands still remain trapped and under siege. We encourage all parties to ensure that these safe passage operations continue and that humanitarian aid reach all those in need. Parties to the conflict must comply with international humanitarian law, including the obligation to limit attacks to military objects. That also includes the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. Compliance is not optional. Madam President, we have heard today from High Commissioner Bachelet of how civilians continue to bear the brunt of this unconscionable war. We condemn the horrific violations documented by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Unlawful killings, including summary executions, conflict-related sexual violence, arbitrary detentions and deportations, including of journalists, human rights defenders, and civil society activists, enforced disappearances, and torture of prisoners of war. All allegations of violations of international human rights and humanitarian law must continue to be investigated and those responsible held to account. The people of Ukraine deserve nothing less. Let's be clear, Madam President. Daily, we see the devastating impact of the use of explosive weapons, including prohibited cluster munitions, by Russian forces in populated areas without regard for civilians. We see the toll of destruction of homes, hospitals, and schools. We know what we're dealing with. It cannot be dismissed as fake news. The sheer scale of destruction in itself belies the Russian Federation's attempt to dissemble and distort reality. We condemn indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks in all circumstances. We reject all efforts to question reality. We are resolved to ensuring accountability for the atrocious crimes taking place in Ukraine. We recognise the important role of the ongoing investigation of the International Criminal Court in helping to pursue this. We must not, we cannot accept impunity for those inflicting such horrors, not in Ukraine, not anywhere else in the world. As you said last week, High Commissioner, accountability is a cornerstone of upholding human rights. We will never shirk our responsibility in upholding human rights. We once again call on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations under international law, to allow full, safe and unhindered humanitarian access for humanitarian personnel, to allow all those seeking to leave Ukraine to do so safely and to destinations of their choosing. Civilians who choose to remain in Ukraine are not combatants. That is a fact, pure and simple. They must be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. Madam President, the international community and this Council must not become numb to the devastation and tragedy that continues in Ukraine. I am marked by the horror of the death of a 91-year-old Holocaust survivor who froze to death in a basement in Mariupol, her life ending under our watch, in a shameful reflection of how as a child she had hidden to save her own life during the war she called the Great Patriotic War. Stopping this war today could not undo what has been done. It could not bring back those lost, nor erase the horrors that those who have been forced to flee have endured. It could not undo the human suffering already caused around the world. But it would stop the slaughter. It would save lives. Russia must end its aggression, comply with its obligations under international law, and withdraw all forces unconditionally from the entirety of the sovereign territory of Ukraine. We call again on the Russian Federation to end its war. It is never too late to do the right thing. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, first and foremost, we wish to congratulate the United States on the accession to the presidency of the Security Council for the month of May. We trust that, unlike the previous presidency, yours will be effective and impartial and objective as is necessary for a presidency when the presidency is held represented by not in a national capacity. When the president carries out their duties, their obligations, and does not act in their national capacity. It behooves me to note for the record a number of remarks for the briefers. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, Madame Bachelet. I will not delve into the essence of what she has stated, nor her unilateral one-sided assessments. We have a number of questions that arose in connection to that. However, I wish to recall for both colleagues and the High Commissioner herself that according to General Assembly Resolution 141, which established the mandate of the High Commissioner, this official is under the aegis of the Secretary General and thereby bears the main responsibility for United Nations human rights action within the framework of the overall authority and decision of the General Assembly, ECOSOC, and the Human Rights Council. No other issues related to the question of the maintenance of international peace and security or protection of civilians fall under their purview. Madam President, for 2 months now, we have been discussing the developments in Ukraine, and for 2 months, beyond the flow of hostility, lies, deceit, fakes, hatred, and insults, we have heard the same old question. How could Russia have, unprovoked, as they say, attacked a sovereign, democratic, non-aggressive, independent, peaceful Ukraine? For it did not pose any threat to Russia itself. Among those who say this or who think this, I allow that there may be those who are sincere, those who may not understand what actually took place for all of these years. There are also people and countries who are sly, who have long dreamed of transforming Ukraine into a bridgehead for a battle against Russia. And they have done everything possible to achieve this since Ukraine gained independence 30 years ago. Politically, ideologically, and today they continue to do this by flooding weapons into Ukraine. What happened in Ukraine itself for all of these years will not fit into the format of today's statement, and it is unlikely that most of you will even want to hear this or understand it, as you previously did not understand and did not wish to understand this. We have repeatedly stated here in this hall, we've talked about things being lost in translation. You hear and you listen to the Ukrainian authorities in the translation, and they have told you and they continue to tell you what you want to hear. We have listened to them, and we continue to listen to them in the original. Without translation, we have known and we continue to know about their machinations, their intractability, their lies, their deceit, including before their own people over the course of all of these years. Instead of providing for their own state, there was an oligarchical, completely corrupt regime which flourished, and even Western sponsors of Kiev winced at this. We are aware how they attempted to create their own ideology based on a repudiation of everything Russian and everything and all that has linked us for centuries. You do not know, and you do not wish to know, about what insults and hatred was targeted against everything related to Russia. Not just at the everyday level, but also at the level of government officials and public figures. You do not know that since independence, absurd Ukrainian school history books have spawned an entire generation of people who have been reared with the hatred of Russia. Russophobia has become the main domestic national product for the Ukrainian authorities and Ukraine's main export. You will not find in Russian society anything of the sort with respect to Ukraine or Ukrainian people. You simply don't hear their slogans. You simply don't notice their torch-bearing marches. You do not see their nationalists and their undisguised Nazis. One intelligent person, a Ukrainian, Ales Buzina, historian, who was killed in 2015 by the nationalists, and he was a patriot of Ukraine. This was a crime, which of course has not yet been investigated, despite the fact that the murderers were well known. So Buzina quite rightly said that with the collapse of imperias on the border line areas, there is extreme, blatant nationalism which thrives and is tinged with the deepest provincialism. And Ukraine is the starkest example of this. Today, this is not a war in Ukraine, contrary to what you may say, contrary to what you say. This is a proxy war of the collective West against the Russian Federation. It is as if you were eagerly awaiting this moment to unleash repression against Russia. And if we are to talk about world war, then without a doubt, it is being waged at the economic level today. We have no doubt that you were preparing for this because the speed with which this was unleashed leaves us with no doubt that you were preparing for this for a long time, well before all of this transpired. You simply are basically morating in the finest traditions of the Wild West. If anybody here is unaware, I will inform you that beyond the countless sanctions and bans, the seizure of private property from Russian citizens who have nothing to do with this special military operation, Western countries froze accounts belonging to Russia amounting to $300 billion. What kind of international law are you talking about then? This is not even the rules-based order which you conceived of. This is not even colonialism when the enlightened West marched to impose civilization on its colonies, looting their national resources along the way. Natural resources. This is nothing other than the most basic lawlessness and plunder. So today, the masks have been cast off, quite simply. And today, however, it has now become trendy to accuse Russia of for the energy and the food crisis which you yourselves have created. For 8 years, we describe to you the suffering of the people in Donbass. We describe the shelling by the Ukrainian armed forces and the nationalist battalions. We told you about the deaths of civilians as a result of these strikes. We described that this was not Donbass which attacked Kiev, but Kiev which attacked Donbass, only because people there did not accept the coup, nor did they accept the policy of complete Ukrainization of the Maidan authorities. You did not respond. You do not wish to recall the fact that such protests in 2014 were brutally dispersed in Kharkov, Odessa, and that very same Mariupol. For all of these 8 years, we told you that this had to be put to an end. Very little was needed to achieve that. The Ukrainian authorities simply had to implement the Minsk agreements, which they publicly repudiated, using your patronage and support, and remaining under the illusion that they would enjoy complete impunity. They enjoyed feeling themselves to be a part of the so-called civilized world. They enjoyed being your vassals. Interesting, in the light of the current circumstances, are the bankrupt Ukrainian authorities deeply regretful of what is now taking place? And now, after all of that, after all of the crimes perpetrated by the Kiev regime and all of the warnings, a special military operation began to liberate Donbass. Now we suddenly heard desperate pleas. What have we done wrong? Those who are knowledgeable in Ukrainian Russian folklore will understand what I'm talking about. And I will respond to this question myself. This is all thanks to your Western sponsorship and patronage. You eagerly rubbed your hands together as you witnessed Ukraine's transformation into an anti-Russia. Everything that is transpiring now began not in late February and not even 8 years ago. This began long ago with the support and encouragement of the United States and their Western satellites. We've repeatedly talked about our concerns, our security concerns, and you in the West brushed them aside. You did not take them seriously. You assured yourselves of the purely defensive nature of NATO, at the same time moving the borders of the alliance right up against our borders. And today you are talking about the global role of the alliance, including in Asia. We advanced our proposals for global and indivisible security architecture. You arrogantly cast them aside, and there's no need to persuade us today about to try to persuade us that your plans never included an attempt, the desire to bring Ukraine into NATO. That was the case. If not today, then tomorrow. We had no illusions, and we have no illusions about that. Once again, we wish to reiterate and underscore the West has no need for Ukraine as such. Ukraine was necessary to the West only as an arena for confrontation with Russia, and Ukraine should also be under no illusion. The West will not help Ukraine only by providing weapons and in an attempt to drag out the conflict, and the West is already waging a proxy war against Russia. Today, we continue to be shocked, continuously are shocked by the hypocrisy of Western partners. The theme, the issue of the progression of the U.S. and the West in Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yugoslavia, the ignoble campaign in Afghanistan, not to mention what preceded, for example, in Vietnam, as if subsided into insignificance. These tragedies, it is as if it is improper to recall these tragedies. Is it as if they never took place? This is ancient history. And the West here is as if beside the point. Of course, for there was a struggle there for democracy, a struggle for democracy. And yes, it came at the cost of millions of people, the destruction of cities and countries. And this was thousands of kilometers from your own home. And today we hear delirious rhetoric about sponsors of terrorism. I will, if I may, pose a rhetorical question. Where did ISIL come from? ISIL was spawned as a result of the U.S. invasion into Iraq, and its bedrock is comprised of former Iraqi army personnel. So who's the real sponsor of terrorism? Today, we are living in a state of an information, or more accurately, disinformation war. Its target is Russia. We have repeatedly pointed to the colossal forces, special psychological operations, which have been deployed on the information battlefield. The objective is not only to tarnish the adversary, but to disarm it, to strip it of access to information, to strip access for information outlets to the international community, and to accuse them of propaganda along the way. The international community needs to hear only one version of the events. The so-called atrocities of the Russian soldiers, the deliberate shelling of residential homes, and the murder of civilians, and the completely delirious idea, the genocide of the Ukrainian people. The West has waged a long-standing artillery barrage on the information field, whereas previously the information war was accompanied the real war. Now this has been reversed. And yet, the international community doesn't need to hear anything about Ukrainian provocations. For example, in Bucha, in Kramatorsk, about the way Ukrainian nationalists use civilians as cover, placing gun emplacements at homes and kindergartens and hospitals, near homes and the flats, civilian residences, the way they push them into basements, they do not let them out, and they do not let them use humanitarian corridors, which Russian soldiers provide every day. And if somebody is able to evacuate, they are often shot in the back by those same persons. There are troves of evidence about this from the Ukrainians themselves. You just don't want to hear it. Have you ever seen evidence from Russian prisoners of war, images of their being tortured by Ukrainian nationalists, which they then post on social networks. Have you ever seen anything similar by Ukrainian soldiers against Ukrainian prisoners of war? Have you seen the reports from foreign correspondents who Russian soldiers bring in to liberated Ukrainian cities, and they provide them with an opportunity to look around and to speak with anybody? Have you ever heard what people from those cities say about the Ukrainian nationalists' conduct and actions vis-a-vis themselves? I cannot but note that the Secretary General's visit to Russia and Ukraine was portrayed both by media outlets and Western politicians in a completely distorted way. There is, in this way, a deliberate impression created that the UN and Ukraine have managed to entice Russia to open up a humanitarian corridor for the evacuation of civilians from the Azovstal steel plant. Incidentally, the Russian side has regularly been opening humanitarian corridors there, and they incidentally are open today as well. The problem lies in the following. The Azov fighters who are at Azovstal prefer to use civilians as human shields, and this is openly talked about by those who have managed to flee. Many of those, contrary to the mendacious allegations of the Ukrainian authorities, have preferred to remain in DPR or voiced a desire to return to liberated Mariupol. And today, the Azov fighters have definitively cast off their masks, demanding for each 15 liberated hostages in Azovstal, in exchange for every group of 15 liberated hostages, for them to be provided with 1 ton of foodstuffs and medicine. Before them, only ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra terrorists acted in this way. The permanent representative quoted Trotsky, of Albania quoted Trotsky, who said that the army is a copy of society. Is this episode what you were talking about? Tomorrow we will hold a meeting on Ukraine's violations of international humanitarian law, an ARIA formula meeting. And it won't be us, but witnesses who will describe to you what they say. The Ukrainians and foreign journalists, come and listen if you have an inkling of a desire to hear objective information. Thank you.
In my role as President of the Security Council, I thank the representative of Russia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Madam President, at the outset, let me thank Ambassador Barbara Woodward and the delegation of the United Kingdom for their able stewardship of the Security Council in April. And I wish the United States success and offer our full support for its presidency this month. I'd like to thank the Secretary General for his briefing and updates on his visit to Russia and Ukraine, as well as for his exercise of his good offices in this conflict. We fully support his continued effort and engagement. Thanks also to Undersecretary General Griffiths and High Commissioner Bachelet and Ms. Luzan for their briefings. As the Secretary General noted last week, civilians always pay the highest price in war. As the conflict moves into its 3rd month, its repercussions have far exceeded many worst-case projections made at the start of hostilities in February. UNHCR now believes that more than 8 million Ukrainians could end up fleeing the country, double the initial estimates. At the same time, UNDP forecasts that the war will soon erase nearly 2 decades of progress in the development of Ukraine. And we have not yet fully absorbed how the impact of this war is reverberating globally, though there are clearly already repercussions being felt through rising commodity prices and supply disruptions, as well as disruptions to the global financial system on which we are all dependent for shared stability and development. We remain deeply concerned by reports of rising civilian casualties and the ongoing destruction of civilian infrastructure. It is imperative to underline once again that all parties must abide by their obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. This necessarily includes respect for the fundamental international humanitarian law principles of necessity, proportionality, and distinction. The Council has built a framework to strengthen the protection of civilians and civilian objects, including its unanimous adoption of Resolution 2573 just over a year ago. Attacks on civilian infrastructure can undermine the provision of essential services to the civilian population and have horrifying knock-on effects. We appreciate the efforts of international actors to provide tools and mechanisms to operationalize this framework, and we call on the parties to engage in the design of urgently needed solutions, including for safe and voluntary passage. We are encouraged by the recent progress regarding safe passage from Mariupol through coordinated action by the UN, the authorities of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, and we're hopeful that it can be built upon. However, as we've underscored before, initiatives like corridors do not alter the obligations of the parties to uphold international humanitarian law. The Secretary-General's proposal of a contact group is a welcome starting point to implement additional measures supporting IHL implementation, and we hope to hear more details about the proposal in the near future. As the conflict continues, we join others in emphasizing the critical importance of increased humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and to the neighboring countries hosting refugees. As part of our ongoing support, the UAE most recently dispatched a plane on the 28th of April carrying 30 additional tons of food supplies supporting refugees from Ukraine and Moldova, and we're committed to continue working with international partners on relief efforts. We emphasize, too, the need to systematically take into account needs based on gender, age, and disability in providing humanitarian assistance, not least as it also supports longer-term recovery efforts. Finally, we reiterate that the protection of civilians can only be assured with a cessation of hostilities and a diplomatic solution to this conflict. We call on both sides to remain committed, despite the difficulties, to direct dialogue and for the international community and this Council to create the conditions to help halt the war and ultimately bring about a lasting peace in Europe and stability to our international order. The alternative, increasing polarization and the resulting ruptures, are in no country's interest, neither today or in the future. We must step back from this brink. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for her statement, and I now pass the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. I congratulate you, Madam President, for your presidency of the Council, and I would like to thank the Secretary-General for his poignant briefing. I'd also like to thank Madame Michelle Bachelet, Mr. Martin Griffiths, and Ms. Tatiana Luzan for their edifying briefings. We wish to pay tribute to the efforts of the Secretary-General to find an end to the war in Ukraine and to provide assistance to those in distress who have been targeted in the combat. His recent visit to Moscow and the Kiev and the mission carried out by UN agencies and the IHC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, bears this out. Madam President, the war in Ukraine continues, and with it a constantly worsening humanitarian situation. 71 days after since the Russian assault on Ukraine, civilians continue to pay the highest price. Lack of water, lack of access to healthcare and to energy all darken the daily life of those who have decided to remain in their country. More than 13 million people have been forced into displacement, including 5.5 million people who have been forced to leave Ukraine since the outbreak of war on the 24th of February. Numerous towns and cities around the country are almost entirely destroyed, including transportation routes. For instance, some railways have been targeted by Russian bombing. We reiterate our condemnation of the war and attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. We appeal to the belligerents to strictly abide by international humanitarian law and to guarantee respect for and protection of all medical personnel and humanitarian workers. Essential infrastructures, energy, gas, drinking water, production and distribution facilities, none of these must ever be targeted. We encourage the warring parties to allow the evacuation of civilians wishing to leave combat zones. In this regard, we take note of the announcement by Russia of a ceasefire and the establishment of a humanitarian corridor for the evacuation of civilians who are sheltering in the Azovstal steel complex in Mariupol. However, it is essential that this ceasefire be effective and lasting. The shockwave from this war is now being felt in myriad countries beyond Ukraine's immediate borders. Pressure is increasing in numerous economic sectors. Uncertainty surrounding the deliveries of agricultural inputs and other products, wheat, cereals, and cooking oil are all a concern to many businesses and families around the world. If the war doesn't end immediately, we fear that the situation of those countries that are already facing serious humanitarian emergencies may collapse. Indeed, the price of foodstuffs, fuels, and energy resources are already reaching unprecedented highs, and we are all, on a personal level, the collateral victims of this. Madam President, neither the political nor the diplomatic signs point to a true commitment by the parties to bring an end to this war. On the contrary, the rhetoric is escalating at the same pace as combat is hardening on the ground. We see increasing flows of weapons and, at the same time, high-level visits. And yet a way out can only be found through dialogue. My country calls on the parties to exercise restraint and to seize all opportunities to meet to resume dialogue. We call for firm commitment to a return to peace and security in Ukraine. This Council cannot content itself with recording the numbers of dead and counting the wounded, while also reconciling contradictions. It is essential that the end of the war be the driver behind all diplomatic action envisaged by the parties. This war must be ended as swiftly as possible. We are horrified by the atrocities that have been reported, and we ask for independent, impartial investigations to be conducted to shed light on the facts, to establish responsibility and guarantee accountability. Madam President, in closing, we would like to say that it is high time for the fighting to stop. It is time for diplomacy to prevail over weapons. Our energies must be directed at achieving a political settlement of the situation. We owe this to the Ukrainian people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President. And before I start, may I thank you and others for your kind words towards me and my team, and wish you a successful presidency. On this subject, I would like to start by thanking the briefers for their statements, and I welcome the Secretary-General's participation in this meeting. On the 4th of April, the Russian permanent representative told the UN press corps that what was happening in Ukraine was warfare, and that in warfare you cannot exclude that civilians are dying. The truth is that it's not just that civilians are dying in Russia's illegal war of aggression, but that Russia is deliberately waging a war designed to terrorize and kill Ukrainian people. Civilians have been executed and dismembered in Bucha and Irpin. No distinction has been drawn between military targets, hospitals, schools, or the Mariupol theatre, outside which children was clearly written, and where the latest reporting suggests that as many as 600 people were killed. Russia's actions are clear violations of international humanitarian law, including, but not limited to, resolutions 2286, 2417, and 2573. Madam President, I'd like to make 3 points on the issue of protection of civilians in Ukraine. The first and clearest solution to end the suffering of civilians is for Russia to end its illegal war and withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Unless it does so, civilians will continue to die, and many millions more will be put at risk across the globe due to food and energy shortages resulting from the invasion. This is what the Secretary-General referred to as the limitless potential for global harm. Second, while the invasion continues, international humanitarian law must be strictly observed and full humanitarian access to civilians facilitated. We commend the Secretary-General and his team for the efforts that led to the evacuation to safety of about 500 civilians from the Azovstal works. But it should be a matter of profound concern for this Council that humanitarian supplies were not allowed into the city and that the shelling of the steelworks restarted immediately. Third, we're deeply concerned that Russia's war is accompanied by a propaganda campaign, including in this Council, designed to dehumanize and demonize Ukrainians by labeling them as neo-Nazis. This hate speech is extremely dangerous. And as we near the anniversary of the end of World War II, it disrespects the sacrifices of those Russians, Ukrainians, and many other nationalities who fought to end Nazism. Finally, Madam President, I want to assure you that the UK continues its help and support to Ukraine, and today we announced a further £45 million for humanitarian and UN organisations to support the vulnerable and provide medical equipment. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now pass the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. Let me thank USG Griffiths, High Commissioner Bachelet, and Tatiana Lussan for your sobering but very important insight into the daily reality of millions of Ukrainians. With a special thanks to the Secretary-General for his briefing and for his recent visit to Russia and Ukraine. You have our strong support to use your good offices in search for a peaceful solution to this senseless, horrific war in Ukraine. Norway recalls that all member states under the Charter of the United Nations have the obligation to settle their international disputes by peaceful means. We support all sincere efforts towards political dialogue, negotiations and mediation. But it is Russia that has chosen to start an unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine and must take steps to end it. President, we welcome yesterday's joint statement by a cross-regional group of freedom of expression mandate holders. We agree that it is precisely during times of war and armed conflict that the right to freedom of expression and free access to information must be vigorously defended. It is instrumental for the promotion of lasting peace, understanding the causes of conflict, and ensuring accountability. President, we continue to be alarmed by the humanitarian situation, including in Mariupol. As you, High Commissioner Bachelet, have highlighted, it seems that international humanitarian law has not merely been ignored, but seemingly tossed aside. Safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access to people in need must be allowed immediately. While we are relieved that the safe passage operation to evacuate civilians from the Azovstal steel plant was successful in bringing some to safety, the poor condition of many of the evacuees shows the urgent need to allow for the humanitarian voluntary safe passage of thousands of civilians and hundreds of wounded out of the city. Norway is deeply worried that Russia's intensified hostilities in eastern Ukraine will lead to new besiegement of entire cities and towns, and that the suffering and bloodshed that has engulfed Mariupol may be repeated elsewhere. We call on Russia to immediately end these relentless attacks on civilians. The continued bombardment of civilian infrastructure must also stop. Ukrainian ports must be reopened to allow wheat and grain to reach those in need globally. The crippling impact of Russia's war on the food security of millions is unacceptable. President, there are abundant indications of massive-scale war crimes being committed. These atrocities will not be forgotten. Individuals at all levels will be held to account. There must be accountability for the sake of the victims and all people of Ukraine. We welcome the International Criminal Court and the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine will continue to coordinate, cooperate and work together with others to investigate possible violation of human rights and international humanitarian law. Also, earlier this week, the UN signed a framework of cooperation with Ukraine on the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence. This is key. This is a key example of positive partnership that the Secretary General's good offices can provide. We strongly support all efforts made to bolster accountability, risk mitigation against trafficking, and access to comprehensive services for survivors. President, I started my remarks today reminding of the obligation of member states to settle their dispute through peaceful means. Russia started this senseless war. Russia must immediately, completely and unconditionally withdraw all its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its international recognized border. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me at the outset to thank the United Kingdom for a successful presidency. I wish the United States all success in their presidency. Let me thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his presence and remarks on the situation in Ukraine. I thank High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, and USG Martin Griffiths for their updates. I also thank Ms. Tatiana Luzan for her insights. Ever since the commencement of the conflict in Ukraine, India has been consistently calling for complete cessation of hostilities and for pursuing the path of dialogue and diplomacy as the only way out. However, the conflict has resulted in the loss of lives and countless miseries for its people, especially for women, children, and elderly, with millions becoming homeless and forced to take shelter in neighboring countries. India has strongly condemned killing of civilians in Busha and supported the call for an independent investigation. We support all efforts to alleviate the suffering of the people of Ukraine. India remains on the side of peace and therefore believes that there will be no winning side in this conflict. And while those impacted by this conflict will continue to suffer, diplomacy will be a lasting casualty. We welcome the visit of the Secretary General to Moscow and Kyiv and his engagement with the leadership of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. We agree that the immediate priority is of evacuation of innocent civilians from areas witnessing intense fighting. We deeply appreciate the efforts of the United Nations in evacuating civilian population from Mariupol. We hope these efforts will extend to other areas as well. The conflict is having destabilizing effect with broader regional and global implications. Oil prices are skyrocketing, and there is shortage of food grains and fertilizers. This has had disproportionate impact on the global south and developing countries. We acknowledge the efforts made by the Secretary General particularly the findings of Global Crisis Response Group Task Team. We welcome their recommendation for exempting purchases of food for humanitarian assistance by WFP from food export restrictions with immediate effect. It is important that similar such exemptions are provided to all member states and relevant stakeholders who are contributing to this global humanitarian effort. The food security challenges emanating from the conflict require us to respond by going beyond constraints that bind us presently. Energy security is equally serious as a concern and needs to be addressed through cooperative efforts. India has been sending humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighbors. We are also providing more medical supplies to Ukraine. We support calls for guarantees of safe passage to deliver essential humanitarian and medical supplies, including through establishment of humanitarian corridors. We hope the international community will continue to respond positively to the evolving humanitarian requirements. We reiterate the importance of UN guiding principles of humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian action must always be guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, which is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should never be politicized. Let me conclude by reaffirming that the contemporary global order has been built on the UN Charter, international law, and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. I thank you.
The representative of India for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of the United States. First, let me sincerely thank the Secretary General for his remarks and for his update from the region. I'm so glad that you've returned to us safe and sound, and I know that you must be jet-lagged after your trip practically around the world, but your being here shows us the commitment that you have to this institution. Also, thank you to Undersecretary General Griffiths and High Commissioner Bachelet for your remarks. And thank you to our civil society briefer, Tatiana Lazan, for joining us at this late hour for you and for your powerful testimony here today. I welcome the representative from Ukraine, as well as His Excellency, the Deputy Prime Minister from Poland, as well as other speakers who are here with us today. Colleagues, there are no signs Russia's war against Ukraine is abating. Russia's forces may have abandoned their attempt to capture Kyiv, but Russia continues to conduct missile strikes against Kyiv and terrorize citizens across Ukraine. Independent media reports have laid out a deadly pattern of attacks in the past 2 weeks. On April 23rd, reports indicate Russian missiles strikes killed civilians in Odessa, including a three-month-old girl. Then Russian missiles hit a thermal power plant, an oil refinery in Kremenchuk the next day. The day after that, Russian forces attacked 5 railway stations across Ukraine. The following day, 2 rockets flew dangerously close to a nuclear plant, posing colossal safety risks to the region. This string of attacks culminated on April 28th, when Russia had the audacity to attack Kyiv while the Secretary General was there to discuss humanitarian aid and peace. Russia has violated the UN Charter. Russia has ignored our unified global call to end this war. The message we continue to hear loud and clear from Moscow is that Russia does not respect or believe in the UN, our charter, and will not be a responsible actor in the international system. Over the past 10 weeks, just 10 weeks, we've seen Russia continue to wage an unprovoked war against a smaller neighbor. We've seen Russia brutalize civilian populations and attack thousands of civilian-used buildings, structures, and vehicles. Apartment buildings, schools, shopping malls, markets, cafes, trams, heating plants, grain silos, food storage facilities, hospitals, orphanages, maternity ward. The list goes on. Russia has lied to this council repeatedly with a wild string of conspiracy theories and disinformation, even falsehood more ridiculous than the last. 3 months ago, Russian representatives told this council they had no intention to invade Ukraine. Now Russia claims the attacks aren't real or never happened. Russia has even claimed that Ukraine is attacking itself, that they bombed their own buildings, attacked their own people, and assaulted their own democracy. These lies defy all logic, all evidence, and common sense. Russia is spreading pure disinformation. The truth is well known. Russia is the only perpetrator of this war. So it's hard to understand why some council members continue to call on all parties to desist. Let's call a spade a spade. Members should call on Russia explicitly to stop its aggression against Ukraine. We have imagery that confirms the presence of mass graves in Bucha, and this is not just an unverified accusation on social media. It is a horrifying fact, one the world must now own started this war, and Russia alone can end it. Silence the guns, withdraw from Ukrainian territory, and embrace diplomacy. Recently, the eyes of the world have been trained on Mariupol, where hundreds of civilians have been taking shelter in a steel plant besieged by Russian forces. We all watched in horror as Russia laid siege mercilessly against civilians trapped inside and underground for weeks. This week, the UN and President Zelensky announced that over 100 Ukrainians have finally been rescued and reached relative safety. And we applaud the UN and ICRC's role in this rescue, and we strongly support the 5 convoys the UN has sent to besieged areas. But we're concerned that attacks on the plant have reportedly resumed with civilians still inside, and we'll be following the situation closely. What we truly need is unhindered access throughout Ukraine so the UN and its partners can reach everyone in need and people of all nationalities can flee to safety. Convoys and evacuations take days and weeks or months of intense negotiation. I now resume my function as President of the Council. I would like to again draw the attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of Note 507, which encourages all participants in council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members of the Council, I also recognize the representative of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. At the outset, let me express gratitude to Secretary General Guterres, Under Secretary General Griffiths, High Commissioner Bachelet, and civil society representative Tatiana Luzan for their briefings. I join all previous speakers in expressing appreciation of a very successful presidency of the Council by the United Kingdom. Last week, the Secretary General visited Ukraine at a time when the country continues to defend the very principles of the United Nations Charter. It was important that Antonio Guterres visited the suburbs of Kiev and saw with his own eyes the horrific war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. I'm grateful to the Secretary General for the clear and unequivocal position on the war against Ukraine as a violation of territorial integrity and the UN Charter. I appreciate the efforts to use the good offices, mechanisms for the de-escalation. Every opportunity must be used to achieve peace. On behalf of the President of Ukraine, I would like to thank the Secretary General, the UN team, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, who demonstrated the possibility of making progress and saving civilians from Mariupol, which is blocked by the Russian army. And I quote, "The whole world has learned about the role of the UN and the ICRC in this. This has shown the international organizations can be effective." End of quote. The second stage of the evacuation operation from Mariupol was completed. 344 people were rescued from the city and its suburbs, in addition to more than 150 people who were taken out of Azovstal. There are still civilians, women, children. Therefore, the evacuation operation must be continued. Madam President, Russia has shelled almost 2,000 missiles on Ukrainian cities. Most of them hit civilians, not military infrastructure. Russia struggles to advance and suffers terrible losses. This is the reason why they resort to this desperate missile terror across Ukraine. They want to break us down, but the only thing that will break down in the end is Russia and its capacity to invade, bomb, murder, loot, and rape. Here I would like to recall one of my compatriots, Alexander Makhov, a well-known journalist in Ukraine, born in the Luhansk region. In 2017, he was the first Ukrainian journalist to visit our station in Antarctica. When COVID came, he was not afraid. He lived in Sanjari, where Ukrainians were brought from China for 2 weeks. From the first day of the full-scale war, he was on the front line, volunteer, ATO veteran, warrior of the 95th Assault Brigade. He was killed in the Kharkiv region in the battles near Izium. He was 36 years old, and my sincere condolences to his family and friends. Russia will bear responsibility for these deaths, as well as for that of every hero who gave their life for Ukraine. Ukraine is not afraid, and the world should not be afraid either. Russia's missile terrorism must be punished and responded to with stronger sanctions and increased military assistance for Ukraine. Madam President, on the 1st of May, the Russian Ministry of War declared that more than 1 million people have been transferred to Russia, including 193,000 children. Most of them, in particular those transferred from Mariupol, undergo filtration camps with mandatory procedures that constitute violations of their human rights, being stripped naked, fingerprinting, interrogation. Eyewitnesses testify that Russian soldiers kill those whom they consider suspicious. There have been multiple reported cases of kidnapping or taking hostage of Ukrainian civilians by Russian troops. There are numerous cases of mistreatment of forcefully displaced Ukrainian citizens in the Russian Federation, including depriving them of their Ukrainian passports and preventing them from leaving Russian territory. We reiterate that all Ukrainian citizens forcefully transferred by Russia must be granted safe return to the territory of Ukraine. Madam President, food security in Ukraine and worldwide appears to be another deliberate target of Russia. As of now, Russia has stolen about 400,000 tons of grain from the temporarily occupied parts of Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Lugansk regions, a third of all reserves in the regions. Given that the stolen grain was to be used before the next harvest, it has already increased the threat of famine. In addition to stealing grain, Russia attacks grain silos, farming infrastructure, and fertilizer stores, and continues to steal farm vehicles. The looting of grain from the occupied part of Ukraine, the blockade of shipments from Ukrainian ports, and the mining of shipping routes endanger global food security. Russia is, in fact, harming not only Ukraine, but the world population through its illegal actions. According to the United Nations, over 1.7 billion people may risk poverty and famine as a result of disruptions in the food production system caused by Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. Furthermore, Russia continues to intentionally block sowing in Ukraine. We demand that Russia stop illicit grain theft, unblock Ukrainian ports, restore freedom of navigation, and allow trade ships to pass. We urge the international community to strengthen economic sanctions against Russia in order to stop its military aggression against Ukraine, to avert a humanitarian disaster and the world's food security crisis. Madam President, today the State of Israel is celebrating the 74th anniversary of its independence. On November 29, 1947, Ukraine, as a member of the United Nations, voted in favor of the UN General Assembly Resolution 181. The following year, in May, Israel declared its independence. Taking this opportunity, I wish peace and prosperity to Israel and all Jews around the world. As we are approaching May 9, the threat of new provocations and the raising of the stakes by Russia is increasing. In this regard, I would like to condemn the anti-Semitic attacks by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on the President of Ukraine and all Jews. Such attacks are absolutely unacceptable. Lavrov could not help revealing the deep-rooted anti-Semitism of Russia's elites. It demonstrates to the world that Putin's Russia is purposefully cultivating Russian supremacy and hatred of other peoples. Russia is already too deeply bogged down in uttering nonsense aimed at justifying its barbaric aggression against Ukraine. In fact, the Russian Foreign Minister questioned the existence of not only the Ukrainian nation, but also the Holocaust. Lavrov deliberately insulted the memory of millions of Jews who died at the hands of the Nazis during World War II. Madam President, at this point, I would like to bring your attention to one of the latest examples of Russian atrocities in Ukraine. On May 4, the bodies of two young men, aged 22 and 23, were exhumed in the village of Rudnya-Talska in Kiev region. On the 25th of February, the Russian invaders shot at a car with them inside. It was not enough, however, for the so-called Russian soldiers to kill innocent civilians. They decided to run over the car with heavy equipment, while the two men were inside. This is insane. This is inhumane. While we are in this meeting, the Russian terrorist practice of shelling Ukrainian cities throughout the entire country with long-range missiles continues. The Secretary General had a chance to witness this practice last Thursday during his visit to Kyiv. There was no, however, strong reaction from the Security Council on this deliberate attack. In this regard, inaction of the Security Council and its ability only to express deep concerns continues to irritate the international community, undermine its authority in accordance with the UN Charter, and create an atmosphere of impunity. As it appears, this chamber has turned from a venue of diplomatic debates into a biological hazard site. There is a trail of blood and a sickening smell of smoldering bodies of women, men, and children that a Russian envoy leaves lingering behind him when entering and leaving this chamber. The air that we inhale is filled with poisonous spores of turpitude when he dribbles torrential lies as his lips begin moving. Victory over the Russian army comes closer by the day, as does the time when Putin's henchmen will sit on the bench at a trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Punishment is imminent, and Milosevic will not stay lonely for too long. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Peter Gliński, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Culture and National Heritage of Poland.
Thank you, Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished members of the Security Council. Let me start by expressing Poland's appreciation and support for the Secretary General's recent trip to Moscow and Kyiv. Each and every effort to restore peace in Ukraine is meaningful. Even if we have to deal with an aggressor who shows very little goodwill and trustworthiness, as demonstrated by the very symbolic Russian shelling of Kyiv during the Secretary's stay in the city. I was also in Kiev and Borodyanka less than 2 weeks ago and witnessed this war on my own eyes. We Poles were very happy to facilitate the trip of Mr. Secretary General and to host him on his way from Moscow to Kyiv. Especially so because Mr. Secretary had a chance to meet with the Polish President Andrzej Duda and to stay in the city of Rzeszów, which has become a crucial hub for the delivery and of assistance to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. As President Duda assured the Secretary personally, Poland will not cease to both deliver aid on its own and to be a reliable partner for all United Nations system institutions involved in providing support for Ukraine. The numbers of the needy and the volume of assistance they require grow with every day the Russian aggression continues. Therefore, we all need to contribute to the relief efforts, alongside the growing Polish aid, both for the refugees from Ukraine staying in our country. As you probably know, more than 3 million war refugees have crossed our border during 2 months. And those hiding from bombs in the Russian-shelled cities and towns. Today in Warsaw, Poland and Sweden co-hosted a high-level international donors conference for Ukraine. The event, which was organized in cooperation with presidents of the European Commission and the European Council, was meant to serve as a platform for pledging much-needed additional funds to sustain immediate life-saving humanitarian assistance for Ukraine. According to early estimates, the conference brought $6.5 billion in pledges. Madam President, we are all still struggling to grasp the full implication of this war, but we already know that its consequences go far beyond Ukraine and Europe. Mr. Secretary General has accurately called the damage to multilateralism caused by the ongoing invasion of Ukraine a three-dimensional crisis, a crisis impacting global food, energy, and finance security. The ripe effects of the Russian invasion will be felt in economies and societies around the whole world. International community needs to engage in devising immediate and long-term policies that will mitigate the impacts of this war and contribute to long-term resilience to global shocks. In 5 days' time, on May 10th, some 50 countries from Europe and Central Asia will gather in the Polish city of Łódź at the 33rd session of the Food and Agriculture Organization Regional Conference for Europe to discuss the very pressing issue of food security and agri-food systems transformation. However, we will not solve the crisis of food, energy, and finance without addressing their root causes. These are the crisis of values, was already mentioned today by Madam President, and the crisis of peace. So in fact, we are facing not just a three-dimensional, but five-dimensional crisis. Therefore, the very first step to take right now is very simple. It requires Russia to stop this war and withdraw all its forces from the Ukrainian territory. Once peace is secured, the international community must turn their efforts to develop more effective measures to protect the fundamental values enshrined in the United Nations Charter. They have been trumped by a permanent member of the Security Council, and we must ensure full accountability for violation of international humanitarian and human rights law committed in Ukraine by the Russian Federation. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Glinsky, for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. We are thankful to the U.S. Presidency for organizing this meeting. Allow me also to thank the Secretary General, Undersecretary Griffiths, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Bachelet, for their insight remarks and the immense efforts. Also, Ms. Tatiana Luzan for briefing us. Madam President, it is the consequences of Russia's continuing military aggression against Ukraine on civilians are dire, especially in Mariupol and near the former line of contact in Donbass. Greece has a particular interest for the Mariupol area, home to a centuries-long established Greek community of more than 120,000, a productive part of the local societies. Alas, these people, along with so many other civilians, families, women, children, face the horror as Mariupol lies almost entirely destroyed. This is why our consuls in Odessa and Mariupol, demonstrating unprecedented courage, strength, and altruism, stayed behind and carried out in total 6 operations called Nostos, the Greek word for homecoming, for the evacuations of Greek citizens and diaspora Greeks from Ukraine. We have repeatedly called for an immediate ceasefire and for the swift operation of humanitarian corridors. It is of utmost importance to scale up humanitarian operations by enhancing the supply chain capacity and providing targeted humanitarian assistance to people affected. The recent evacuations in the Azovstal plant and Mariupol, achieved thanks to UN persistent efforts, demonstrated in the most obvious way that when there is a will, there is a way. We hope to see more initiatives like this taking place. Greece has been actively engaged in providing humanitarian assistance. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Nikos Dendias, himself spearheaded one of Greece's assistance operations to the historic city of Odessa. At the same time, we all witness the huge wave of migrants this war has provoked. Greece is showing solidarity to Ukraine as well as to frontline member states, welcoming thousands of refugees from Ukraine. Madam President, the amount of devastation and destruction is inconceivable. Greece remains engaged in the reconstruction of Ukraine and will be present in coordination with our partners in order to do everything possible to bring back these two cities to the previous state and to facilitate the diaspora Greeks' return to normal life after this tragedy. Our Prime Minister has already announced that we are ready to rebuild a maternity hospital destroyed by Russian shelling in the city of Mariupol. In the same vein, Minister Dendias has reiterated our support for the reconstruction of Odessa. There can be no peace, no reconciliation without accountability. We will continue to actively raise the issue of Mariupol in all fora and emphasize that the perpetration of war crimes should be thoroughly investigated. Only peace can bring an end to this immense tragedy with far-reaching repercussions to the world over. We commend the recent visit of the Secretary General in the region and his efforts towards peace. We stand firm in our call for dialogue and diplomacy to prevail. Greece, a pillar of stability in the region of Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, reiterates its unwavering commitment to international law and the UN Charter. Refraining from threat or use of force is the guiding principle underpinning our Charter. We are steadfast in our support to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as of every UN member state. These are fundamental norms of international relations. Their violations, no matter who they target, are threats to us all. There is no room for exceptions. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia. I thank the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, High Commissioner Bachelet, USG Griffiths, as well as the OCHA and NGO representatives for their insightful but sobering briefings. We appreciate the Secretary General's important visits to Kiev and Moscow, in particular, his humanitarian plea and engagement, which have resulted in very practical, life-saving humanitarian action on the ground, notably in Mariupol. We also positively note the close cooperation between the UN and the ICRC in this regard. In the future, the UN should build further on this, although limited success. Unfortunately, these achievements are far from solving the tragic security and humanitarian crisis caused by the Russian aggression. Moreover, many more people remain trapped in the Azovstal iron and steelworks complex, in conditions that humanitarian workers have described as hell. Yet, it has been again under heavy fire from the Russian airstrikes. We call on Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and allow safe evacuation of remaining civilians trapped in this complex. We also call on all relevant UN mechanisms to maintain their focus on the situation of civilians affected by the Russian aggression in Ukraine, especially on the rescue and evacuation from the areas of persistent hostilities. Madam President, it has been more than 2 months since Russia, a permanent member of this Council, launched its aggression against Ukraine in grave violation of international law, including the founding principles of the UN Charter. Russia has persistently ignored the calls of the UN General Assembly, as well as the order of the International Court of Justice, to cease aggression and to immediately and unconditionally withdraw all forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine. We strongly condemn Russia's contempt to the UN Court, Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, as well as the involvement of Belarus as Russia's accomplice. Russia's unjustified and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has triggered one of the fastest growing displacement and humanitarian crises on record. Over 17 million people inside and outside Ukraine now are in the need of humanitarian assistance. 7.7 million people are now internally displaced, and more than 5 million refugees have fled into countries neighboring Ukraine and beyond. 90% of refugees are women and girls. They need urgent humanitarian assistance, a cessation of hostilities and safe passage, including through the creation of humanitarian corridors to allow those who wish to do so to leave voluntarily to the destination of their choice. In this light, we are concerned about the reports of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, including children, forcibly moved to so-called filtration camps and then to the territory of the Russian Federation, often unaccompanied by their parents. Madam President, Russia's denials, deceptions, lies, disinformation, war propaganda, incitement for violence, and dehumanizing language against Ukrainians do not change the fact that Russia is committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other violations of international humanitarian and human rights law against the civilian population in Ukraine. As underlined by the UN Secretary General, those directly responsible for these war crimes and violations on Ukrainian soil must be held accountable. There will be no impunity. There will be accountability for this horror, and international justice will be done. The Baltic states will continue to steadfastly support all efforts to ensure independent and effective investigations into crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, we were among the first to refer the situation in Ukraine to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and we will continue to support the Office of the Prosecutor in its investigation concerning alleged war crimes and war crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine. Madam President, the impact of Russia's war against Ukraine is reaching beyond Europe. Millions of people globally are already on the brink of famine, and Russia's invasion will further exacerbate the negative impact on global food security and prices on the world market, therefore increasing the threat of hunger to many countries. Ukraine is the world's 5th largest exporter of wheat. However, the shelling and bombing makes it almost impossible for Ukrainian farmers to sow. On top of this, Russian Federation is blocking hundreds of ships filled with the wheat in the Black Sea. 20 million tons of grain from the last year's harvest have been trapped in Ukraine due to Russia's blockade and bombardment of Odessa seaport and the military closure of the sea lines in the Black Sea. This is the result of the Russian aggression and not sanctions or anything else, as Russia's propaganda suggests. We call on Russia to unblock Ukrainian ports to restore the freedom of navigation, and we encourage the Security Council and the relevant UN agencies to consider the ways to ensure the safe passage for grain-carrying ships from Ukraine's territorial waters to the Black Sea. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for your statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Thank you, Madam President. Today's interventions by the Secretary General, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, and the High Commissioner for Human Rights confirmed the extraordinary gravity and the multidimensional character of this senseless war. This is at the same time an unprovoked military aggression a blatant violation of the UN Charter by a permanent member of the Security Council, as well as a humanitarian and human rights crisis of dramatic proportions. From a political perspective, we cannot but reaffirming the fundamentally illegal nature of this war, which violates the prohibition of the use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of a sovereign country, the obligation to settle disputes peacefully, and the prohibition of targeting the civilian population. For this reason, while we reiterate once more our unwavering support for Ukraine's full independence within its internationally recognized borders and condemn the Russian military aggression, we appreciate and strongly support the diplomatic initiative taken by the UN Secretary General with his recent mission to Moscow and Kiev. Let me reaffirm our conviction that we need to take urgent steps towards peace. In the words of the UN Secretary General Guterres, achieving a wide and sustainable ceasefire would be the first of these steps. Madam President, from a humanitarian perspective, the conflict in Ukraine is not only fueling one of the most severe humanitarian crises in Europe since the World War II, it's also exacerbating a global food security crisis. Italy renews its call on Russia to ensure safe, rapid and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance and to allow the export of crucial Ukrainian agricultural goods in order to alleviate also the challenges faced by numerous states of the global south depending on these products. We also strongly support the Secretary General's proposal for a humanitarian contact group composed of Russia, Ukraine and the UN officials. Italy has stood by Ukraine and its people since the beginning of this crisis with general budget support, loans, and support of the humanitarian activities carried out by the UN system and the Red Cross in Ukraine and in neighboring countries. However, as humanitarian needs continue to increase as we speak, we are evaluating additional humanitarian initiatives in terms of funding and in-kind donations. Madam President, from a human rights perspective, this aggression is dramatically affecting defenseless and innocent civilians, including those in most vulnerable situations, such as women, children, elderly persons, and persons with disabilities. As documented by the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, Russian armed forces have indiscriminately shelled and bombed densely populated areas. This is unacceptable, and we strongly advocate for the establishment of safe passages for the evacuation of civilians. We are particularly concerned also by the large-scale destruction and damage of civilian infrastructures, including medical and education facilities, the number of journalists and media workers killed and injured since the start of the conflict, and sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls. Italy welcomes all measures to ensure full accountability for human rights violations, as well as violations of internal humanitarian law occurring in Ukraine, and fully supports the Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council and the investigation launched by the national authorities and the ICC on war crimes. This is why Italy, together with the more than 40 states parties, has indeed referred the situation of Ukraine to the prosecutors of the ICC. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Italy for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovakia.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, let me congratulate you on this month's presidency of the Security Council, and we would like to express our full support to your work and the initiatives that you will have ahead of you for the rest of the month. You can count on our continued support. I would also like to thank Secretary General and all other briefers for their sobering presentations, which unfortunately confirm our ongoing grave concerns about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine in particular, of course, in addition to many other aspects of the ongoing war. And High Commissioner Bachelet mentioned that, in fact, it is the 71st day of the war. And we have mentioned also in previous meetings already that one more day of this terrible tragedy is too many. So it's appalling to see that we have to continue counting in this way, and we really hope that the tragedy will stop as soon as possible. We thank the Secretary General for his recent visits, his intervention, and his work has been extremely important. Of course, it includes the locations that he visited outside of Kiev on the 28th of April. And at that point, he said, and I quote, "There is something everybody should remember everywhere in the world. Wherever there is a war, the highest price is paid by civilians," end of quote. And I would like to bring this to the attention of the Russian Federation and call on Russia to immediately cease its hostilities against Ukraine, in particular any attacks against civilians and civilian objects, and to hear the countless calls, including the calls from the Secretary General, and unconditionally withdraw all troops from the whole territory of Ukraine. We have heard yet again today victim-based narrative from the permanent representative of the Russian Federation, which is completely out of place and out of context. And I would also like to add to that call the fact that this false narrative and the distortion of facts should immediately be stopped. The facts are clear. It's clear to us who the aggressor is and who is suffering. The only thing which is not clear to us is why the innocent civilians have to continue suffering already for 71 days, and we unfortunately have to continue counting. According to the OHCHR, as of the 4th of May, there have been 6,635 civilian casualties, 3,238 people killed, and 3,397 injured. I'm mentioning the statistics just to again remind the aggressor that we know the facts, and they are all clear. And there is, and there will be, no impunity for the crimes committed. But what is worse is the reason of the human suffering caused. We already condemned the Russian decision to start the senseless war under the pretext of the special military operation and the so-called need of denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. But what we recently heard from Foreign Minister Lavrov, who claimed that Adolf Hitler was partly Jewish, is particularly hideous and confirms our approach based on the firm struggle for fighting against disinformation of the Russian Federation concerning the war in Ukraine. Slovakia, as a neighbor and partner and a directly affected country in the context of refugees fleeing the conflict, is particularly alarmed by the crisis as a result of the Russian aggression. Almost 5.7 million refugees have fled the country. Since the beginning of the aggression of the Russian Federation, about 394,000 have entered my country so far. We have welcomed them. We will continue doing that for as long as necessary, and we will continue to stand in solidarity with them as a close friend and a good neighbor in these most challenging times. Let me conclude by reiterating our ongoing support to our neighbor. In this regard, Slovakia is one of the largest donors per capita in military, humanitarian, and financial assistance. But let me say, we would rather not be. We would rather do something else, focus our efforts on other issues. But the time of need is something which is extremely important for us. And as they say, a friend in need is a friend indeed.
This was also marked during today's high-level international donors conference for Ukraine held in Warsaw, where the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Mr. Eduard Heger, announced additional financial contribution of €500,000 for international organizations to be provided for the humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Madam President, I add my wish that at least for the rest of this month or for the upcoming period, this will not have to be repeated again in a similar fashion. But of course, if we have to gather again, we are ready to do that, and we will continue working with you closely. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovakia for your statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank the Secretary General, Under-Secretary General Griffith, High Commissioner Bachelet, and Mrs. Lausanne for their insightful briefings. Further, I want to thank the Secretary General and all UN staff for their tireless efforts to minimize the human suffering in Ukraine and neighboring countries. Germany strongly supports these efforts. We were relieved about the successful evacuation operation from Mariupol. The people remaining trapped need to be safely evacuated as soon as possible to the destination they want to go to. Excellencies, in a few days, the world will commemorate the day when the Second World War, unleashed by Nazi Germany, ended. 77 years after this watershed moment of world history, Russian propaganda tries to create an outrageous link between the truly heroic fighting of the Red Army, including many Ukrainian fighters, then against the Nazi regime, and the Kremlin's current aggression against Ukraine. This apparently aims at creating a completely alternate reality in which Ukraine's president leads a failed state that needs to be denazified. This utter nonsense is beyond cynicism. The whole world can see what so-called Russian liberation looks like. The pictures from Mariupol, from Irpin and Bucha speak for themselves. These mass atrocities and crimes against humanity have to stop. The perpetrators must be held accountable in accordance with international law. To this aim, Germany will contribute to the International Criminal Court with additional funding and secondment of experts. Meanwhile, the German Federal Public Prosecutor General has opened structural investigations, preparing the ground for indictments on charges of war crimes. Even if Russia again tries hard in tomorrow's area formula meeting to impose its narratives on the world outside, it will not succeed in altering reality. Rapes, torture and killings will be brought to the fore. The ones responsible will be brought to justice one by one. Madam President, millions of people are fleeing from attacks, from bombing and shelling. Germany has so far recorded more than 600,000 refugee arrivals, and over 90,000 Ukrainian children are attending at least temporarily German schools. It is children that suffer the most from Russia's war of aggression. Their schools are being destroyed. These kids' peaceful lives have been disrupted. Many had to leave their families behind. All this and all they want is to go home and return to their beloved ones. In this connection, reports about the Russian parliament planning to ease rules for the adoption of Ukrainian children are extremely concerning. We will follow this ideologically motivated motion with extreme scrutiny and hold Russia accountable for its deeds. UN agencies as well should play an active role in this regard. The war in Ukraine has dramatic consequences on humanitarian crises in other parts of the world and on global food security. Russia ravages agricultural potential in Ukraine, while at the same time preventing grain exports by blocking the Black Sea, and absurdly tries to blame Western sanctions for increasing food prices. Currently, an estimated 4.5 million tons are stuck in Ukrainian ports, and the Ukrainian representative here in this meeting has reported that Russia has stolen tons of grain from Ukraine. With the expected delays of the next planting season and shortages of seeds, we are standing on the brink of an unprecedented global food security crisis. Germany is strengthening its humanitarian response, especially through WFP. We are also committed to putting global food security high on the agenda, among others in the upcoming meetings of G7 foreign, development and agricultural ministers. The German government has also already announced 430 million euros in additional funding for the crisis response outside Ukraine. This is additional to the means we have been able to pledge for Ukraine, including in the Warsaw Conference. My message to the countries economically affected by the repercussions of Russia's war of aggression is, you can count on our support. The food security crisis proves that the war transcends the borders of Europe. A permanent member of this council is trying to annex new lands by force. If we allow Russia to set a precedent, who will be next? Which former empire will feel encouraged to attack its weaker neighbor, justifying this by a distorted notion of history? If we do not want to open floodgates for recolonization, the world must stand united in rolling back Russia. We once again call on Russia to stop its aggression immediately. Russian troops encounter fierce resistance, not only from the brave Ukrainian military, but from a huge bloc of states that stand up for the UN Charter and the rule of law. Continuing the senseless war will only lead to more bloodshed, and it is never too late to change course. Russia must withdraw its troops, now and for good. The upcoming Day of Liberation, that we all commemorate, will provide an excellent opportunity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.